Part 2. Chapter 13. Europe and the War. If democracy is defeated in this battle, if fascism triumphs, His Majesty's government can claim this victory for its own. With these words, Lloyd George pointed out a new fact. In the view of the world, the Spanish Civil War had assumed the guise of an ideological war. Although no other nation was overtly engaged in the conflict, it had become a European one. Henceforth, and especially after the weakening of the revolutionary parties on the Republican side, the Spanish Civil War was just another aspect of the struggle between the great powers in Europe. It was this struggle that had brought about the Italo-German rapprochement and the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis that cruelly showed up the uncertainties and contradictions of the Western democracies, France and Great Britain, and that in turn steered Russian policy toward cautious expectancy. The European balance and the Spanish Civil War. To understand to what point the Spanish Civil War had upset the European political balance, it must be remembered that in 1936 the German position in Europe was still precarious. After the accession of the Nazis to power in 1933, Germany had broken with the League of Nations. Hitler's rearmament and his territorial claims were giving the small neighboring countries cause for concern, though as yet they were not impressed by his power. Otherwise, the diplomatic position of the Western powers appeared strong. The entente between France, Great Britain, and Belgium looked solid. French influence in the Balkans remained considerable, in spite of the murder of Alexander of Yugoslavia in Marseilles in 1934. Finally, the government of the Third Republic, faced with the danger of German rearmament, had just strengthened its system of alliances in the East. In 1935, mutual aid pacts had been signed between the USSR and France on the one hand and the USSR and Czechoslovakia on the other. The re-establishment of German power greatly perturbed the Russians. Hadn't Hitler indicated Bolshevism as the first enemy to be fought? The Italian fascist government found itself in a difficult situation too. Its campaign against Abyssinia, intended to create a veritable African empire, had mainly proved its military inefficiency, and a large majority at the League of Nations had decided to take sanctions against the Mussolini government. The Italian fascist state and the German Nazi state, thus isolated in Europe, had found the opportunity for a rapprochement in the Spanish conflict. This war, by permitting a general political confrontation, had precipitated alliances and realignments. It had forced each power to take a stand. In this sense, it had created the political conditions for world war. To the Central European dictatorships, the Spanish conflict did not merely imply a trial of the democracy's weaknesses. It was the dress rehearsal, the first clash, the testing bench for their weapons against those from Russia and Czechoslovakia, the first use of material intended for bigger battlefields. One has only to read the countless articles and works written on this subject to judge the interest that this limited war aroused on the military level. By contrast, the strategic and economic significance of Spain now took second place. Important as it was to have bases like Majorca and Ceuta, and still more so to make use of the tin and copper mines in Asturias and Rio Tinto, this factor could not be decisive to the point of seriously affecting the direction of international policy. With the grave events of summer 1938 and the Sudeten question, Spain became just one more pawn in the European game. The recognition of the nationalist government. How were the European powers to make their choice between the two camps pitted against each other in Spain? Legally, the situation was simple. There was a properly elected Spanish parliament which had to appoint a government. These were the only bodies whose legality was indisputable. After the relative failure of July 19th, the nationalists were simply military rebels in control of certain provinces. They were perfectly aware of this themselves, because in the early months all they did was to establish an authority officially intended to disappear after victory and make way for a proper government. Their capital, Burgos, was ignored by the other countries, even those most actively sympathetic toward nationalist Spain. When Franco, after his appointment as Spanish head of state in October 1936, sent a telegram of greetings to Hitler, the latter did not reply, thus showing that he did not consider it advisable to recognize Franco officially for the time being. When Welczek, the German ambassador in Paris, took stock of the Spanish position in Berlin, he quite naturally contrasted the Spanish government with the rebels. But assuming that the European chancelleries refused to give the rebels belligerent rights, which could only be granted to a legal authority, they could not allow them to obtain supplies of war material from foreign states either. This situation was not long in hampering Italy, Germany, and Portugal considerably, and their chancelleries came to devise a whole string of arguments to justify their intervention. It was the left that, by manipulating the electoral law and thereby encouraging the establishment of a popular front government, had created the revolutionary situation. The legal forms of government had themselves disappeared since the February 1936 elections, and the military leaders had revolted in order to re-establish them. We shall merely recall that the electoral law had been voted by a right-wing assembly that believed that it was thereby ensuring a long term of government for itself. At any rate, such legal arguments were used only with caution. The fascist governments preferred the method of the fait accompli. In order to give a respectable diplomatic form to the recognition of the nationalist authorities as the government of Spain, the German and Italian foreign ministers, von Neurath and Chano, wanted to wait for the fall of Madrid. A German plan for communication with the Spanish chargé d'affaires in Berlin, projected in late October 1936, began with these words: "Now that General Franco has seized the Spanish capital of Madrid and his government thereby controls the greater part of the country. For want of any other basis in law, the possession of the capital and its administrative buildings de facto control would make a distinction between the real country and the legal country possible. At any rate, a pretext would then exist in the form of a need to guarantee the defense of German interests." The departure of the Republican government for Valencia seemed to anticipate this event, but the capital resisted, and the war threatened to go on. Now induced to take a firmer stand, the Germans and Italians finally decided, on November 18th, to go ahead with the de jure recognition of the Burgos government. Portugal followed suit. Naturally, the assertion that the Franco government controlled the lion's share of the territory seemed just as false in mid-November as the assertion that there was no longer any government authority in Republican Spain. Actual control over the territory by the nationalists did not extend to any of the country's Mediterranean or central provinces, and, although the situation was still fairly fluid in loyalist Spain, the Caballero government certainly had far more authority than any of its predecessors. It was therefore paradoxical to maintain relations with the Spanish Republic in August and to break them off in November. However, this change of attitude helped to clarify the international situation. The powers in sympathy with Franco thereby showed their willingness to regard Spain's legal government as an actual enemy. The breach created between the great European powers was all the clearer because it coincided with the signing of a German-Italian-Japanese pact, prelude to the establishment of a formidable military bloc. The formation of the Axis on the eve of the July 18th pronunciamiento, in spite of their similar political attitudes and their equal hostility to socialism, the fascist and Nazi governments were at odds on many points. The two powers had, in fact, betrayed expansionist ambitions that were likely to bring them frequently into competition. Moreover, Italy regarded the Mediterranean as a preserve and was suspicious of an eventual German intervention in Spain. But after August and September 1936, the firm attitude of the Central Powers toward the Spanish question, in contrast to Western tergiversations, and their joint willingness to step up their military preparations had helped to settle their differences. The formation of an extreme right-wing government in Romania under Antonescu was a prelude to negotiations that meant rupturing the balance in Central Europe in favor of Germany and Italy. It was during talks with Horthy, the regent of Hungary, that Hitler first called attention to the agreement between Rome and Berlin to back Franco. And the Hungarian government more or less had to support this joint action, as Budapest was at that time seeking, through a rapprochement with these two great powers, a guarantee in support of its own claims over Magyar minorities, especially in Romania. The improvement in Italo-German relations became clear at the end of September 1936, with a visit to Rome by the German Minister of Justice, Frank, received personally by the Duce. Frank pointed out on this occasion that the Führer regarded the Mediterranean as an Italian sea, and that his intervention in Spain was unconnected to any expansionist ambitions. When it was Mussolini's turn to state that he did not wish to alter the geographical positions, he did, however, make one reservation in favor of the Balearic Islands, which had been saved by Italy. The key point in this conversation was stressed by Count Chano. Two fronts have already been set up in Spain. On the one hand, the German-Italian front, on the other, the French-Belgian-Russian front. The Duce agrees with Hitler in the opinion that the definition of both fronts is henceforth a fait accompli. The idea was launched of an alliance and a division of Europe into zones of influence. The decisive move was not, however, made until the end of October, on a journey to Berlin by Count Chano. The conversation between the two foreign ministers, von Neurath and Chano, on October 21st, endorsed by a secret protocol and Hitler's reception of Count Chano at Chesterblade, resulted in an entente between both countries on specific questions, of which some were in fact burning issues, Mussolini stated in Milan on November 1st. The most burning issue was, of course, the Spanish question. The main lines and even certain details of the joint move had been studied. They were, on the diplomatic level, the methods of recognizing the Franco government and, in the military field, the portion of the military effort to be contributed by each power, especially where aircraft were concerned. Germany and Italy took stock of the common ground between their interests. The enemy against which the Rome-Berlin axis had officially been formed, Bolshevism, was at large in Spain. The idea was to rid the Iberian Peninsula of every communist, or even Marxist threat. To assert itself, the Axis, Chano told Hitler, had to deliver the coup de grace to the Madrid government. In fact, Rome and Berlin had promised to help the leaders of the Movimiento long before the insurrection had broken out. This support could, if necessary, be accepted by the other powers so long as there was no question of any large-scale traffic. But, on July 31, 1936, the announcement that some Savoy Marchetti planes had landed by accident in French Morocco revealed the extent of the Italian intervention and provoked a violent crisis between Paris and Rome. In addition to this incident, there was the threat to Tangier posed by Franco's army. Tangier was under international control but surrounded by territories that had rallied to the revolution. The French insisted that the Spanish government should have free use of the port. The Italians protested. This was a first and important diplomatic test, because the use of Tangier as a base would enable the Spanish government to hamper the passage of troops from Morocco through the Straits of Gibraltar considerably. In the end, England's benevolent neutrality enabled the Italians to obtain satisfaction. The role of the English authorities, moderate and even favorable to nationalism in this matter, clearly reflects the British government's opinion and the division among the Western countries. These were, without doubt, the two elements that determined the policy of non-intervention. The French position: there is a good deal of information about the origins of the French non-intervention proposal, especially in Leon Blum's statements to the Parliamentary Commission of Investigation in 1947, which have never, in their general outline, been refuted. We must not, however, forget that Leon Blum, aware of the bankruptcy of his Spanish policy, was less concerned with defending it than with justifying himself in an attempt to prove that, during the summer of 1936, there was no possible policy other than his own. Faced with the nationalist military coup de force, which Blum dubbed a coup de theater, the sympathies of the French Popular Front government were won over in advance to the Spanish Republican government. But could such sympathies remain platonic? On July 20th, Blum was faced with the problem raised by the request for material aid drawn up by the Gyrol government. Request you negotiate at once with us for supply of arms and planes. There was nothing unusual about this telegram. In addition to the common interest between two Popular Front formations, it referred to a particular agreement according to which France had a monopoly for supplying arms to Spain. Not only could Gyrol apply to Paris, he was even obliged to do so by this commercial treaty. At the time, Blum had no hesitation. The conversations that he had between the 20th and the 22nd of July with Delbos, and in particular with Daladier, then Minister of War, had the sole aim of working out the size of the aid to be given to the Spanish government and the means for accomplishing it. But between the 22nd and the 25th of July, the date of the cabinet meeting that was to make an official decision about French support for Republican Spain, several new facts emerged. First was a fact of external policy, which was no doubt the most important because it had a considerable influence on Leon Blum. The French premier had noted, on a visit to London planned long before the events in Spain, the hostility of the Baldwin government to any intervention in the Spanish conflict, a hostility first indicated in a warning by the journalist Pertinax, it is not well recorded here, and confirmed by the cautious advice of the English Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Blum had been disagreeably surprised by this. His entire foreign policy was based on the Anglo-French Entente, which seemed to him more necessary than ever in the face of German rearmament. To take action over the Spanish affair without the agreement and even against the wishes of England seemed difficult to him at first glance. His return to France was the occasion of a new disappointment. A press campaign had been launched in El Echo de Paris by Henry Carrillis, who had made public certain measures decided on in order to come to the aid of Spain. The offensive had begun with an article by Cartier, published on July 23 and entitled, "Will the French Popular Front dare to arm the Spanish Popular Front?" He ended on an extremely violent note. "We are still reluctant to believe that the government could commit this crime against the nation." The details mentioned in the articles in L'Echo de Paris concerned deliveries of planes and bombs, 75mm field guns, and machine guns. It is interesting to note that there was an allusion in it to the principle of non-interference, for which the French government had to take responsibility a week later. No doubt the right-wing opposition should not have been expected to lighten the task of the French government. But Blum ran into opposition within the government itself, as well as in moderate parliamentary circles. The Senate, traditional soil for conservative opposition, was undoubtedly the more affected. Hence the vehement remarks of its president, Jean Ney, that we should be induced to make war over the affairs of Spain is something no one can understand. The radical attitude was even more disturbing. The radicals in the French government held the two key posts of foreign minister and minister of war. Their crossing over to the opposition would provoke a serious ministerial crisis. In such circumstances, one can imagine the impact of the intervention of Édouard Herriot, who added to the cautious advice of Eden and Jean Ney, "Don't meddle." How can one explain the panic in French political circles merely at the prospect of consignments of arms to the legal government of Spain? First, by the pacifism of the period. The French left, until about 1934, had never stopped proclaiming its love of peace and its desire to safeguard it by every means, as much on the radical as on the socialist side. France had accepted, without reacting, measures as serious as German rearmament and, more recently, the remilitarization of the Rhineland solely for fear of provoking a conflict. The hopes of many socialists lay in a new Treaty of Locarno, which they considered making with Germany and Fascist Italy. Such illusions were certainly not shared by Blum. He foresaw the conflict and agreed to undertake a French rearmament program that would enable France to catch up to some extent on German progress in the military field. But he himself was a moderate who could not have envisaged taking the risk of starting a war on his own. It has been added, and Blum himself has stated, that the threat of foreign war was duplicated in France by the threat of civil war. In France we too were on the verge of experiencing a military coup d'état. It must be conceded that a section at least of the right, very nationalistic since 1919, had for some years exhibited a far less intransigent loyalty to the state. Through sympathy for the German and Italian regimes, it preached in turn a pacifist policy, giving priority to its domestic troubles, aggravated by the social crisis of 1936 and the accession of the Popular Front, rather than to its foreign preoccupations. This right-wing opposition did not merely appear in the Echo de Paris articles. Blum said of the events of 1938, "In the French Parliament there were some influential politicians who were representatives of Franco. In such unfavorable circumstances, the cabinet, meeting on July 25, no longer dared to consider aiding the Spanish Republicans openly but merely sought means of concealing arms deliveries. They used the method of imaginary sales to the Mexican government, which was free to use the arms thereby allocated to it for Spain. This was only the first setback. A few days later, the Savoie-Marchetti incident would have enabled it to reconsider this concession." But Blum recalled that the press campaign launched against his government was being nurtured by many foreign articles, especially English and Belgian, which could not fail to affect public opinion. For Churchill, whose hostility toward Nazism during this period was beyond question, inflexible neutrality is the only solution for the moment. A much more serious fact was that the French government was far from unanimous. The premier merely indicated that the ministers had been divided after the third cabinet meeting about the Spanish question on August 8. Furthermore, it may be said that the supporters of supplying arms, grouped around the Air Minister Pierre, were in a minority against the coalition, made up chiefly of radicals and socialists of the Paul IV persuasion. To reverse this trend and to avoid at all costs the isolation in which a policy of intervention on behalf of Republican Spain threatened to place France, Blum saw only one recourse: to win over England. This explains the friendly welcome he had given the Noël Baker proposal to send Admiral Darlas, Navy Chief of Staff, who was regarded as a thoroughly Republican leader, on a mission to London. The mission entrusted to Darlas consisted of getting in touch with the permanent Secretary of the Cabinet, Sir Maurice Hankey, through the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Chatfield, whom he knew personally. If Darla managed to persuade him of the need to prevent Franco from seizing power, Hankey could then initiate a cabinet meeting and possibly a modification of the English attitude. In fact, it is doubtful if the British cabinet meeting at the beginning of August would have altered its fixed attitude in any way. England saw too many drawbacks to taking part in the Spanish Civil War. Her mining interests on the mainland did not allow her to break with any of the enemies involved. Moreover, the English were contemplating a return to a détente in the Mediterranean after the period of tension typified by the Ethiopian affair in the preceding years. There were signs of a rapprochement with Rome, and an Anglo-Italian naval pact was being drawn up. All reasons for not taking up an entrenched position diametrically opposed to Italy's. Finally, the British conservatives sympathized far more with General Franco than with the Reds, whose revolutionary excesses had been thoroughly reported by the conservative press. Lord Chatfield's opinion of Franco as a good Spanish patriot no doubt merely reflected that of most of the ministers. In such circumstances, the Darla mission could only end in failure. Chatfield refused to intervene. English policy was not altered. This abortive move was the last diplomatic effort made by the French government on behalf of Republican Spain. The August 8 cabinet meeting took note of the isolation of France, which could count only on Czechoslovakia and the USSR in Europe. It must also be conceded that the Russian government was merely lavishing kind words on the Spanish Republicans and waiting for France to take the first step on the path of intervention. The French ministers, who accepted the principle of sending Spain some 50 consignments intended in any case for export, did not think that it was possible to send artillery or air force equipment from the army's reserves. Blum was justified in thinking that a policy based on a continuation of this sort of intervention would only create diplomatic embarrassments, without any worthwhile returns. The Spanish Republicans would receive very little material and probably not of the best quality. Blum then contemplated resignation and only gave up his plan at the insistence of his Spanish friends Fernando de los Rios and Jiménez de Azua. Non-interference. It was in such circumstances that the French premier took the initiative with a proposal for non-interference in Spain's domestic affairs, a proposal that was to be put to all the great powers as well as to the lesser powers who were directly involved. The policy of non-interference, or more precisely of non-intervention, was without doubt a generous idea, a liberal principle adopted by England at the beginning of the 19th century against the active interventionism of the Holy Alliance and the Metternich system. In the mind of the French premier, it was also a political idea, to bind Germany and Italy with an international pact, which it would be difficult for them to break, and to prevent them from giving effective aid to Franco. The proposal made by the French government would either call attention to the bad faith of the Central Powers and would indirectly give France far greater freedom of action, or would in fact halt the Italo-German intervention. Moreover, if a decision were made not to fight a war, or if the capacity to fight it seemed lacking, wasn't it necessary to use every means to prevent it? When one has responsibility for peace and war, Delbos said on December 6, one has no right to give in to emotional impulses. The following day, Blum pointed out, I believe that last August Europe was on the brink of war, and I believe that she was saved from war by French initiatives. In fact, the problem of an international pact on the Spanish question had been raised on August. Count Welczek, in a letter to his government on August 2, envisaged a joint move by 4 European powers, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, and France, to call upon the Spanish combatants to lay down their arms. This proposal was not followed up, but on August the French government appealed to the other countries, inviting them to conclude a non-intervention pact regarding the Spanish conflict. This appeal was followed by diplomatic approaches to each of the capitals concerned. Great Britain's support for this proposal had been secured in advance. In it she saw approval of the attitude of strict neutrality she had observed until then. The Conservative government's memorandum on this subject stated that the British government would be happy to see the rapid conclusion of a pact between the powers likely to supply arms and ammunition to Spain, so that they will abstain from doing so and put a stop to the supply of arms and ammunition from their respective territories. However, the British government is of the opinion that a pact of this kind must, from the outset, be accepted simultaneously by the governments of countries such as France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Great Britain who have large material interests in Spain or are geographically close. But in order to obtain a simultaneous declaration, unreserved agreement from Germany and Italy was needed. Against all evidence, Count Chano stated on August 3 that there had been no interference, even indirect, by the fascist government, and, wanting a reason for refusing to sign the French declaration, took cover behind the need to consult the Duce, who was in fact absent. The German foreign minister, von Neurath, replied in kind that the German government, since it was not meddling in Spain's domestic affairs, had no statement to make and that, in any case, it would be necessary to include the USSR in an eventual pact. These prompt and possibly contrived answers paved the way to a series of confused negotiations and time-wasting schemes that were actually intended to win time and to enable Germany and Italy to supply the nationalists with the arms necessary for winning a victory which it was then possible to imagine would be a rapid one. In the reply sent on August 6 by the Italian foreign minister to the French ambassador, Chambrin, Italy raised three questions. First of all, what was to be understood by intervention? Didn't the solidarity expressed through public demonstrations, press campaigns, subscriptions, and the enrollment of volunteers already amount to a blatant and dangerous form of intervention? The Italians mentioned the attitude of the French and Russian press in this respect, thus trying to show that a Franco-Soviet bloc had been formed against which every measure taken would be a defensive one. Similarly, when the French ambassador, François Poncet, remonstrated with the German foreign minister about the help given to the rebels, von Neurath kept reminding him of deliveries made to Spain. The Central Powers had scored an initial point. Giving one's support to the legal government of Spain was placed on the same footing as giving it to the insurgents. The second Italian question was an attempt to find out if the commitment made by the governments would be binding only on states or on individuals as well. Its interest lay in the fact that from the outset the German and Italian intervention had taken shelter behind the fiction of sales by individuals or private companies. Finally, the Italian government raised the question of methods of control. This objection was far more serious. The French plan for a declaration in fact provided only for communications between governments, which would not amount to real control over the measures adopted. Was this kind of control possible? Did the French government itself have complete faith in its effectiveness, or would it have been satisfied with a declaration of principle that would have reassured public opinion and made really large-scale aid to the nationalists more embarrassing? At any rate, it can scarcely be doubted that neither the Italians nor the Germans would have accepted effective control. The basic aim of their requests was to drag the matter out. Berlin also asked questions that the French government was incapable of answering. Since the French ambassador was counting on favorable replies from a certain number of governments, the Belgian, British, Dutch, Polish, Czech, and in particular the Soviet government, von Neurath insisted that promises should also be obtained from the United States, Sweden, and Switzerland, knowing that Switzerland would take shelter behind her neutrality and that the United States would always refuse a declaration of principle that would offend a number of American subjects. The government of the Third Reich also asked what would prevent the Comintern from taking action, even if Soviet Russia had entered into international agreements as far as she herself was concerned. What control was in fact to be exercised over an international body? Finally, how could it be guaranteed that arms and volunteers did not cross the French frontier? I explained, Count Welczek wrote on August 10, that France, as a frontier state, was in a privileged position and that the export of arms as well as the crossing of passes in the Pyrenees by volunteers were very difficult for the government to control. In fact, the Portuguese frontier was just as important, but the French government apparently did not think it a good idea to raise this argument, no doubt through fear of revealing the ineffectiveness or inadequacy of its plan. Moreover, in spite of these objections, it did not seem as if Germany or Italy wanted to offer formal opposition to a pact. Neither of these two powers seemed really anxious at this point to unleash a European conflict. Germany was not yet wholly committed to the Spanish Civil War. Hitler did not feel that, in principle, a ban could greatly hamper traffic with the rebellion. Thus, on August 17, the German government declared itself ready to fall in with the proposed pact, on condition that the decision would be valid for the other states and for private firms. To meet these continually renewed objections, diplomatic overtures were made by France. Switzerland and the USA, while refusing to sign any document, stated that they were prepared to apply the embargo. This left Italy, which sought to delay completion of the agreement but finished by accepting the French plan, though not without many reservations. Her acceptance in principle was handed to the French ambassador on August 21. Thus, the majority of European powers had subscribed to the principle of non-interference and had even officially announced a ban on the export of arms intended for Spain. The French moderates, like the British conservatives, could count themselves satisfied. The risks of a general conflict had diminished. But it was still necessary to answer the Italian objection on methods of control. The truth was that the Italian government took little interest in serious control. Also, it confined itself to asking for the establishment of a commission made up of delegates from the various powers, with the task of supervising the application of the embargo. No one dreamed of pointing out that this commission would be taking on authority that belonged by right to an international organization, the League of Nations. Perhaps the League's failure over the Abyssinian question was too fresh in people's minds. It was, at any rate, a clear sign of the disrepute into which it had fallen. The Non-Intervention Committee, all the powers declared themselves in agreement on the principle of forming a committee. But its precise role had not been defined. For the French government, it had to permit the establishment of a permanent link, and consequently real control between the different countries. It was therefore necessary to invest it with political powers. For the German and Italian governments, which had no intention of respecting the declarations on the embargo, it was, in Dieckhoff's words, necessary to avoid this institution's becoming a permanent political instrument likely to cause us trouble. There was a contradiction between these two attitudes, but an English move led to agreement. Entente was reached with the definition of the committee as a simple de facto meeting of diplomatic representatives, and, as such, having no powers of decision. It was agreed by the powers concerned that the delegates would merely have exchanges of views, which could, in certain cases, become a more detailed examination of complaints made. Finally, an additional satisfaction was given to Italy with France's formal consent. The Non-Intervention Committee was to sit in London, and not in Paris or Geneva. It is remarkable that the diplomatic move by the French government in early August slipped from its grasp and passed to the British. The committee and its powers, according to the French charge in Berlin, were more an English invention. In spite of the desire for appeasement shown by the Western governments, negotiations dragged on for over a month, and it was only on September 9th that the committee's inaugural session took place in London, in a hall symbolically named the Locarno Room. 25 powers were represented at it, including Lithuania and Luxembourg, but not Portugal. Though she had accepted the principle of non-intervention, the only practical result of this first session was to give the committee its definitive name of International Committee for the Application of Non-Intervention in Spain. The German charge in London, Prince Bismarck, retained the impression that what mattered to France and England was not so much a question of taking actual steps as of pacifying the aroused feelings of the leftist parties in both countries. For all that, this task of appeasement should have been fairly easy in England where, on September 10th, the trade unions had come out against any intervention in Spain, on a motion by Sir Walter Gittrine, Secretary-General of the TUG, and Ernest Bevin, Secretary of the Transport and General Workers' Union. At the beginning of October, the Labour Party conference, held in Edinburgh, endorsed this attitude, proxy votes providing a crushing majority in favor of non-intervention. Meanwhile, since early October 1936, the international situation had once again been growing tense, in spite of the precautions taken by the committee to sweeten the tone of the debates and not to provoke excessively violent quarrels. Reports had piled up, which pointed to constant intervention in the conflict by Italy and Portugal, in spite of pledges given. There was first and foremost the dossier compiled by the Spanish Republican government and handed to the League of Nations. There was the report published on October 4th by a commission led by 3 British MPs, indicating aid from Italy and Portugal after the formation of the committee. Finally, there was the decision taken by the Soviet government to make public a violent attack on Germany, Italy, and Portugal, accusing them of violating the Non-Intervention Pact and threatening to withdraw from the committee. The Soviet government cannot, in any event, let the non-intervention agreement be transformed by some of those taking part into a screen for concealing military aid to the rebels. Consequently, the Soviet government finds itself obliged to state that, if such violations do not cease at once, it will consider itself freed from its obligations under the agreement. This Russian statement was the first of a series of notes officially drawn up for the Non-Intervention Committee. It provoked a lively response. Yet there was nothing UN justifiable in this communiqué. The accusations contained in it cannot be denied, and its conclusion is perfectly logical. But it had been agreed that the work of the non-intervention committee should be carried on in camera in order to avoid unrest and the dangers of a public discussion. By publishing its communiqué, Moscow broke this vow of silence, and did so deliberately. On the other hand, the violations of the non-intervention agreement by the fascist powers were already known through Spanish documents. The Russians were not producing anything new. Why then did they wait to make this outburst, whereas they had long been acquainted with the facts? This can only be explained by conceding a radical change in Russian policy toward the Spanish problem during the first fortnight of October. Be that as it may, there was no breach during the full and stormy session on October 10th. The chairman of the non-intervention committee, Lord Plymouth, presented the documents that had been handed to him in his own name and in that of the British government. He came up against a stay of execution from the accused powers, who confined themselves to stating through their delegates that the facts contained in the Spanish and Soviet statements were pure fantasy. The Portuguese representative, who was now sitting on the committee, adopted an even more uncompromising attitude. He left the meeting hall, though he added that he would not thereby cease to take part in the committee. If the Russians had intended to demonstrate the complete impotence of the non-intervention committee, they had fully succeeded. Once again it was the French delegate, Corbin, the French ambassador in London, who saved the committee through his moderation. He asked the Russian government to suggest the means that it envisaged for making control effective. The French premier's zeal in preserving the non-intervention agreement cannot be doubted, and his representative has played an especially salutary role in the committee's recent discussions. Wrote the Times on October 13th. The session was adjourned without a date being fixed for the next meeting, because it was necessary to obtain replies from the three indicted governments in advance. These replies took a long time coming. This was the time of Franco's greatest military successes, and any control, especially over the Portuguese frontier, threatened to compromise the rapid victory anticipated by the nationalists by hampering the arrival of reinforcements and arms. On October 6th, the Russian government had asked for the dispatch of a commission of investigation to the Spanish-Portuguese frontier, but, without acceptance by the Portuguese, such a measure would have been unenforceable, had it been adopted by the non-intervention committee. The Russian delegate then asked for a watch on the Portuguese coastline. This new demand met with a negative response from Lord Plymouth. In such circumstances, it was difficult to envisage a diplomatic solution. The aid given to the Spanish Republicans by the Soviet government after October provided the Axis powers with an excuse to revive the discussion. Henceforth, the meetings of the non-intervention committee were mainly taken up with the accusations hurled at each other by the delegates from Germany and Italy, on the one hand, and the Russian representative on the other. On November 10th, as an unexpected conclusion to these discussions, the committee decided that the accusations had not been proved. Who could take such an attitude seriously? One had only to read the newspapers to find plenty of information about landings of Italian troops, the arrival of international volunteers, and the dispatch of arms and ammunition to both sides. Non-interference had become a tragic farce. Plans for control in order to try and return to the problem again. The British government submitted a plan to the Committee for the Control of War Material destined for the two sides, which provided for supervision of land and sea cargoes. This plan, put forward on November 12th, was finally adopted on December 2nd, in spite of Portugal's abstention. The length of the negotiations was the result of a fresh maneuver by Germany and Italy. Adopting tactics already used successfully, they claimed that the British proposals were inadequate and asked, in addition, for air control. It is pointless to emphasize the futility of this request in the absence of representatives of the Control Commission at airports. Since supervision would have had to be exercised on the land frontiers of Spain and in her ports, it would also have been necessary, once the principle of control had been accepted by the great powers, to obtain agreement from both Spanish governments, a thing that could hardly be counted on. Moreover, during the course of the same session on December 2nd, a new problem had arisen, which from then on took priority in the negotiations: the problem of volunteers. There is an urgent need, Blum told Welksek, to halt the influx of troops and war material. This urgency must not have seemed so evident to the great powers, because discussions continued throughout December. This was not, of course, the fault of the French government. On the contrary, the latter stated that it was ready to agree to control not only of the Pyrenean frontier, but also of its troop locations and airports, and its arms factories and other installations. It was a worthless proposal, because France was the only power to consider such a sacrifice. To settle things once and for all, the British government then temporarily abandoned its idea of control and confined itself to asking each government to ban its nationals from any military commitment in Spain, to take effect on 4 January 1937. Even this plan, so limited in application, did not succeed in winning approval. Russia refused to accept a decision without control. Germany, Italy, and Portugal stated that the problem of intervention ought not to be only partially solved. By the end of 1936, the failure of the talks was so complete that even the British stopped persisting in them within the Non-Intervention Committee, and the German foreign minister considered generally ceasing to maintain the committee system. This lethargy did not prevent negotiations from reopening when, on January 8, Germany and Italy, acting in full agreement, framed a reply in which they declared themselves willing to agree that the question of volunteers should be the object, as was asked, of a special agreement that would ban recruitment and departures from a date in the near future. In fact, the Italian government was the only one that would have willingly continued its delaying tactics, but it was forced to reckon with its German ally. The latter did not seem prepared to push things too far. It felt that the Non-Intervention Committee provided an excellent screen, which ought to be preserved from destruction. There were still many leaders in Berlin who approved of the English attitude and did not wish to provoke a quarrel with the government in London. Also, in a note issued on January 25, the two governments stated that they had already introduced legislation empowering them to ban departures by volunteers. They were merely waiting for agreement among the powers in order to put it into effect. This goodwill was, however, qualified by the fact that Berlin refused to allow Control Commission officials to operate in German ports. Control within Spain was also out of the question because of negative replies from the nationalists and the Republicans. At any rate, it was at last possible to glimpse some upshot to the interminable discussions held since the committee's formation. The plan for air control was abandoned by common consent as impracticable. Control on land, like control at sea, had to be effective, and the German government, feeling that the German-Italian troop dispositions were adequate as they stood, now called for an increase in the number of officials and posts. Presumably, the 150 inspectors scattered along the French frontier would not at any time have been able to prevent smuggling altogether. And this was even truer of the Portuguese frontier, easier to cross, longer than the French frontier, and watched by the same number of inspectors. Maritime surveillance was entrusted to an international naval patrol. But, instead of setting up joint control, the plan divided the Spanish coast into 5 sectors, each to be guarded by one of the great powers. On February 26, the USSR, which had the job of watching the Bay of Biscay, stopped taking part in the patrol, no doubt through her anxiety not to commit her already inadequate naval forces to an obviously pointless task. Moreover, to entrust Germany and Italy with surveillance at sea, while Italy in particular had contributed handsomely to supplying Franco-Spain with warships, could seem farcical. But it was true that the establishment of control could restrict any too obvious forms of intervention, and for the first time there was good reason for taking the Non-Intervention Committee seriously. Even Portugal finally conceded the need to accept control. As we have said, the Anglo-Portuguese agreement, made on February 21, provided for the deployment of 150 observers in ports and at transit points. The date of March 8 was even fixed for the start of the application of control measures. In a first phase, officers with the task of supervising control would appear in their assigned spots, but their work would only become effective after all the necessary officials had been recruited. To the British government, this was merely a first step. Halting the flow of volunteers to Spain in March and April 1937, when the war had been on almost 9 months, was comparatively easy, because the majority of foreigners coming to fight in Spain had already crossed the frontier. England therefore proposed, in order that the principle of non-intervention should be genuinely respected, that the volunteers should be recalled to their countries of origin. On this point, all hopes of agreement swiftly vanished. The Italian representative, Grandi, whose excesses of language had already often helped to inflame discussions, stated coldly, at the full session of the committee, that the Italian volunteers would not quit Spanish soil before Franco's complete and final victory. The news of the Italian defeat at Guadalajara merely hardened this stand, since Mussolini was unable to consider leaving Spain after such a humiliation. Thus, only the acceptance of land and sea control could restrict the power's intervention in the Spanish conflict. But the coming into force of control during the night of 19 to 20 April 1937 swiftly demonstrated the futility of this policy. The Civil War had begun 9 months earlier. It had taken 8.5 months of negotiations to attain a result whose limitations escaped no one, and which was again put into question in May. 8.5 months of abortive discussion to reach an agreement that lasted less than a month and a half. Behind these futile talks was a far more disturbing diplomatic reality. We have seen two aspects of it: the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis, soon to be followed by the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the isolation of France, which hesitated to pursue the Russian alliance, and which sought frequently reluctant English support. By December 7th, Blum admitted that a certain number of our hopes and expectations have in fact been disappointed. After December, the French political error became still clearer, in that German-Italian intervention merely increased. Chapter 14. German-Italian intervention. In Spain, from the moment that a plot had been organized to overthrow the Republican regime, the monarchists and soldiers had naturally considered the help that fascist Italy could provide them. This was in spite of any repugnance that the Spanish monarchists and Catholics might feel for a regime that had been forcibly imposed on royalty and whose relations with the Church still remained precarious. There was no question of an agreement on principle, but there was one of common interest. In other words, something much stronger. The first contacts went back several years. Ansaldo, who had piloted Sanjurjo at the time of his first attempt at a pronunciamiento, as he did again on July 20, 1936, had a meeting with Balba in 1932, at which the latter promised him Italian support. After the failure of the coup de force, Ansaldo returned to Rome with Calvo Sotelo in 1933. The same year, the Nazi Party seized power in Germany. On the eve of the movimiento, Sanjurjo traveled to Berlin to make sure of Hitler's support as well. There were certainly encouraging noises from Berlin, but German rearmament was still only in its infancy, and it seems that the Reich government cautiously promised its support only when the uprising had been underway for a few days. In spite of the wishes of Rome and Berlin to see a sympathetic regime installed in Madrid, it was clear that both governments were sizing up the risks of failure. Even Salazar's Portugal, which was more interested still in the disappearance of Republican Spain, and whose proximity enabled left-wing propaganda to be leveled dangerously against the presidential government, respected certain forms. The field where Sanjurjo's plane had been forced to land at the start of the uprising was a makeshift airstrip, which partly explains the accident that befell the leader of the movimiento. Italian intervention. Italy, however, had given more serious assurances. On March 31, 1934, an agreement had been reached between the Spanish monarchist leaders and representatives of the fascist government, and promises had been made about supplying material. As soon as even partial success was assured for the rebel troops, the promised aid was not long in coming. From the outset, Italian intervention was swift and massive. During the war, everything was done to help Franco and to ensure victory. The fascist leaders, in fact, regarded the nationalist venture as a personal affair. Mussolini saw action in Spain as a chance to exhibit his talents as a military leader. He stepped up military conferences and gave orders to the Italian Navy that submarines should prevent warships from arriving in red ports. His own son, Bruno, exhibited his talents as an aviator in the Balearics. The Duce's government made victory in Spain a question of prestige. This war was an opportunity for Italian arms both to triumph over an enemy other than the tribes of Abyssinia and to establish some important strategic bases in the Mediterranean. Thus emerged the dual Italian policy, which tried to impose itself in the Balkans and in Spain, in the eastern as well as in the western Mediterranean. The weight of Italian intervention cannot be explained by ideological considerations. Of course, the struggle against Bolshevism was being carried on in Spain, and the Italian soldiers fighting there were represented as crusaders for an ideal. But this was only a facade. To Mussolini, supremacy in the Mediterranean was vital, and the Rome-Berlin Axis could only be formed after assurances from the Germans that they had no ambitions in that area. Important issues were at stake. A considerable effort had been made to convince the Italian population of this, but they remained frankly unenthusiastic. Even senior officials such as Cavagnari, the Minister of the Navy, did not show the enthusiasm that the Duce wanted them to feel. Though fascism had thrown itself wholeheartedly into the Spanish adventure, the Italian masses had not followed. The troops sent to Spain could have been made up partly of volunteers, selected primarily from officers on the active list. Ciano's diaries bear this out. Capini asked me for a command in Spain, and I gave him satisfaction on the spot. But the name given to the Italian forces, Corpo Truppe Voluntari, CTV, must be taken with a grain of salt. Recruitment was organized quite officially in the military offices and the headquarters of the Fascio, where there was talk only of leaving for Abyssinia or for an unknown destination. And most of the soldiers intended for Spain were probably detailed from previously trained troops. At the beginning, this had been mainly from those who had fought in the Abyssinian campaign. At any rate, it was not a question of isolated groups but of a genuine expeditionary corps, with its flags and its leaders. At first General Roata had command. He relinquished it during the Biscay campaign to Bastico, who was replaced first by Berti and then by Gambara. Although its deployment in the fighting was always under the control of the General Staff in Salamanca, the CTV preserved its individuality. The Italian soldiers did not reach Spain in large numbers until November 1936, when their presence became necessary to ensure rapid success for the nationalists. But from then on, considerable efforts were made. On December 29, Hassel reported the departure of 3,000 black shirts, along with a contingent of 1,500 technicians. On January 14, 1937, he announced a further reinforcement of 4,000 men. At the same time, the dispatch of a division, to leave between the 24th and the 26th of January, was under preparation. These shipments brought more than 50,000 men to Spain before the start of February 1937 and enabled 4 divisions to be trained and equipped. Later on, the number of Italians fighting in Spain fell slightly. At the end of January 1938, Mussolini mentioned 44,000 men to Goering. On July 1938, according to the German ambassador, they numbered 40,075, to which must be added 8,000 men sent by way of reinforcement a few days later, for a total figure of almost 50,000. If we add an undisclosed number of technicians, and if we consider that the 4 divisions present at Guadalajara were later reduced to 2, it must be conceded that in March 1937, when the Italians were at their most numerous, there could not have been fewer than 70,000 of them. Eden referred to 60,000, but this was certainly below the true figure. The Italian contribution was all the more important because the forces that Franco and Mola were able to put into the front line at that time could not have exceeded 250,000 men. The technicians had been necessary at the start of the conflict for the handling of air equipment to enable Franco to cross the Straits of Gibraltar. It was urgent, and there was no time to train the Spanish airmen. The transport planes and bombers that flowed into Morocco and then into Seville were accompanied by their crews. It is certain that the presence of these planes in comparatively large numbers, at one time there were 6 Caproni bombers on the Seville airfield in addition to some Italian submarines, made an effective contribution to transporting Moorish troops and the Spanish Foreign Legion. Moreover, it was the presence of Italian planes in the Balearics that enabled the nationalists to repulse the attempt made by government troops, fairly well armed but without any anti-aircraft defense, to recapture Majorca. From this moment, the island of Majorca became the chief base for the Italian legionary planes, which should not be confused with the planes handed over to the nationalists. The Italians, Mussolini pointed out to Ribbentrop, had 3 airfields and a few warships permanently in Majorca. The planes that carried out almost daily raids on Valencia and Barcelona from 1938 onward took off from there. Mussolini and Ciano had certainly regarded the occupation of Majorca as the establishment of a strategic base that, by virtue of its position, must have greatly strengthened Italian power in the Mediterranean. However, at no moment was there any question on the Spanish side of giving the island up. On the contrary, Franco made a point of indicating in all his statements that he would not tolerate any foreign encroachment on Spanish territory. Here, without doubt, was an initial misunderstanding, which helps to explain the many Italian complaints about expenses incurred on behalf of the Spanish nationalists and never repaid. Moreover, Italy did not confine herself to sending planes Caproni and Savoy Marchetti bombers, Fiat and Arado fighters, more than 700 in all, whose presence, precious as it was, did not in itself suffice to bring victory to Franco's troops. After the initial failures, Rome became energetic in the naval field. On this last point, Italian aid increased markedly. 2 submarines and 2 destroyers were delivered at the end of August 1937, and 4 new submarines in September, etc., according to Chano's diaries. Although it is hardly possible, with sources that are too often contradictory, to compile a precise record of the material aid received by the nationalists, certain figures quoted by Colonel Vivaldi may be used as a basis. 1,930 field guns, more than 10,000 automatic weapons, and 950 tanks. Armor and artillery accompanied the troops committed after February 1937. Participation by the Italians in military operations. The Italian divisions were assembled in Seville during the early months of 1937, before they were sent to the separate Madrid and southern fronts. Faupel, the German ambassador in Salamanca, noted on January 7 that there were 4,000 black shirts in Seville. 2,000 more were on their way to this rallying point. He estimated that the whole of these troops would be committed within a fortnight. In fact, there was a slight delay, and Rwanda could scarcely put more than 5,000 men at the disposal of the Southern General Staff for the first operation in which CTV troops were to take part. It was only a small local maneuver which led to the occupation of Estepona in the Msalaga sector on January 15 and of Marbella on the 17th. The major operation planned against Malaga was put off but for only a few days, because on January 18 Faupel reported 20,000 men with 2 artillery batteries and 1,800 trucks around Seville. The offensive against Malaga, February 1937, it was natural that the Italians, armed and equipped in the south, should have been placed under General Queipo Delano's command to take part in the only large-scale operation that was carried out in this sector during the whole of the war. On the other hand, the scheme, in the works since December, did not seem to present any major difficulties in spite of the mountainous terrain. It was therefore an excellent test for Rwanda's forces. Although Colonel Villalba, the defender of Malaga, did not have any well-organized troops and lacked arms and especially artillery, the Army of the South prepared its offensive with great care. The overambitious plan, directed at Motril to try to encircle the defenders of Malaga, had been abandoned in favor of a converging movement. The Spanish troops advanced along the coast, while 3 Italian columns from Antequera, where Rwanda had set up his headquarters, Loya, and Alhama moved on the town from inland. The cruisers Canarias, from which Queipo supervised operations, and Balliers supported the offensive. The forces committed by Rwanda were still limited to 3 Italian regiments, 2 mixed regiments, and 2 companies of tanks, supported by planes based in Seville. The Battle of Malaga may be regarded as one of the first successful lightning operations, thanks to the mechanized equipment at the attackers' disposal. The offensive had begun on February 3, but there was no real contact before the 5th, proof of the weakness of the Republican defense. On the afternoon of the 5th, armored units made a deep thrust along the Antequera-Madrid road. In spite of the bad weather, which slowed down operations and prevented aircraft from intervening in the early stages, victory came extremely rapidly. On the morning of the 8th, the first nationalist troops entered Malaga. On the 10th, Motril was occupied. With thousands of prisoners and tens of thousands of refugees blocking the roads and facilitating the Italian advance, there was a general stampede by the Republican Army, an encouraging result for the CTV. The occupation of Malaga was of great importance politically because it was a red town, and it was also an essential supply base. The Italians were in a better position to equip their divisions, now heading for Madrid. The size of the Italian forces made it almost impossible to conceal the material and human aid now being supplied to Franco. In any case, after the capture of Malaga, Rome stopped disguising its intervention. On the contrary, it was stressed that the operation had been carried out by volunteers, and that the assault tanks and the Italian infantry had reached the town and left it behind. Even in cautious England, the Manchester Guardian did not hesitate to describe the Battle of Malaga as an Italian victory. On March 9, the attack began in the Guadalajara sector. 4 exclusively Italian divisions, commanded by Generals Rossi, Capi, Nuvolari, and Bergonzoli, were joined by mixed brigades of arrows, black arrows and blue arrows, with Italian officers and NCOs. These Spanish contingents under Italian command survived until the end of the war. They remained in communication with the CTV to the extent that, in the closing months, the arrows were incorporated into the CTV. At the beginning of the Battle of Guadalajara, the offensive was carried out by the Capi and Nuvolari divisions backed by the Spanish Moscard division, and with considerable armor, especially light tanks. The other 2 Italian divisions were held in reserve. But the maneuver grew in scope, and the whole of the CTV forces was soon involved with 200 assault tanks. The result is known: failure and a rout whose military consequences should not be exaggerated, but which dealt a severe blow to the morale of the Italians. Mussolini had expected much from the CTV. "The rout of the international forces," he wrote to Mancini, "will be a triumph of great political as well as military bearing." On March 2nd, the Fascist Grand Council hailed the imminent victory that was to mark the end of all Bolshevik designs on the West. And on March 9th, the Italians jeered at their Spanish allies. Why so many months to take a defenseless town? But the enemy's bitter resistance and its propaganda by leaflet and loudspeaker soon affected the morale of the legionaries, who thought they were all set for a triumphal march. On the 16th, the officers were reminded of their responsibilities. The troops are lacking in dash and tend to overestimate the enemy. A state of exultation had to be created by showing them that their enemies were the brothers of those whom the fascist squads had thrashed on the roads of Italy. But a few days later, the situation had worsened. Some black shirts inflicted wounds on themselves. Others deserted. Even the best and bravest troops have cowards in their ranks. It was too late to check their flight. The Italian command itself asked Franco to relieve the CTV. This defeat, after the boasting of the Italian leaders, was the cue for jokes on the part of their allies. The Germans in Salamanca said that, Jews and communists though they were, the men of the 11th Brigade had fought like Germans and were able to thrash the Italians. Moscard's men sang, "Guadalajara is not Abyssinia. The Spanish, though red, are brave. Less trucks and more hulls." But there were more serious things than songs or even the incidents that broke out between Spaniards and legionaries, as in Tangier on March 26. Guadalajara had been a grave defeat for fascism. The Italians had shown that they were not prepared to die for Mussolini's ideal. The Italian High Command, disappointed, agreed to restrict the attacking power of the Expeditionary Corps. The 4 Italian divisions were reduced to 2, the Littorio and the March 23rd. Only the brigades of Arrows were kept as they were. The forces thereby reconstituted provided a greater capacity for resistance. The useless and incapable were no longer put in the front line. Henceforth, Italy did not send any more large contingents, except to replace losses incurred. The latter were heavy. More than 1,500 killed and wounded at Guadalajara. During the first 20 months of the war, the Italians lost 11,552 men killed, wounded, or missing in Spain. The total dead was 6,000. Such casualties naturally added to the bitterness caused by the reverses. The Italian leaders and generals, who had advocated massive intervention in the hopes of a large military success and a rapid victory, were wondering if their troops should remain in Spain. They shed responsibility for the mistakes on the Spanish command. "Our generals are worried, and they are right," said Chano. Mussolini himself betrayed his impatience. On several occasions after December 1937, there was talk of withdrawing the volunteers. But these were mainly outbursts of bad temper. The Italian interest in this affair was too great for there to be any serious question of abandoning it. In the end, the CTV remained to the last, to give proof of Italian solidarity. Italian debts. The Italians shared in Franco's triumph. But they had paid heavily for it, not only in terms of human lives and by abandoning a large quantity of heavy equipment, but also by the considerable sum spent on the operation. Mancini told me, Faupel reported on January 18, 1937, that Italy had invested up to 800 million lire in the Spanish affair. Mussolini himself stated, during a conversation with Goering, that expenditure by the end of the same year, 1937, was 4,500 million lire. By the end of the war, it had reached 14,000 million lire. Part of the sum thus spent was later repaid by the nationalist government, but only part. At that time, the Italians had contemplated seeking compensation in eventual economic advantages. But here, too, results were disappointing. At the beginning of 1937, Mancini complained that Italy had not, so to speak, derived any profit from Spain. Commercial relations improved later. In November 1937, Chano noted with satisfaction the arrival of 100,000 tons of iron, of which the Italian war industry stood in particular need. Other compensations could also be envisaged. There is also, said Mussolini, a political problem. The Italians wanted nationalist Spain, saved exclusively by Italian and German aid, to remain closely linked with their system. On the other hand, the financial aspect of the problem was also linked with the political aspect. Only if Spain remains within our system can we be fully compensated. This system was the German-Italian axis. Henceforth Mussolini looked to nationalist Spain's entry into the Anti-Comintern Pact. But on a practical level, the results of political negotiations between Rome and Burgos were slender. Hopes of setting up strategic bases in Spain had been dashed. The only important point scored by Italy was the November 28, 1936 agreement, the official aim of which was to develop and strengthen relations between both countries. The agreement consisted first of a Mediterranean pact. The two powers were to carry out a joint policy and give each other mutual aid in the Western Mediterranean. Along with this went a non-aggression pact, a promise of benevolent neutrality in the event of conflict, and finally a promise of economic entente, underwritten by the application of a preferential tariff to the co-signatory. It is none the less remarkable that the first undertaking to which Italy subscribed, by signing the protocol, was to give Spain her aid and support for the preservation of the country's independence and integrity, as much on the mainland as in the colonies. Italy thereby relinquished all hope of receiving, in exchange for her unrepaid expenditure, any territorial compensation. "We are giving our blood for Spain. Isn't that enough?" Chano asked in March 1938. In fact, Italy had also given a lot of money, but in vain. German intervention in this field, at least, German moderation contrasted with the fascist government's lack of caution. Naturally, Germany had far less immediate interest in the Mediterranean than Italy, and total victory by Franco was not absolutely necessary to her government. It is unquestionably true that Berlin was not seeking any political advantage in Spain, because the Germans had no illusions on this subject. They did not suppose that National Socialism could ever be introduced in Spain, and the German leaders' sympathies for Franco remained extremely delicate. Also, it was felt in Berlin that an agreement that did away with the extreme left and steered Spain away from an alliance with the West would be a satisfactory solution. In the same way, one of the considerations of the war was to expose the natural hostility that existed between Italy and France. Moreover, German military circles did not have unlimited faith in the abilities of the Spanish generals, including Franco. On this point, the Italian and German general staffs were in complete agreement and did not hesitate to pass on to Burgos advice that was seldom heeded. In any case, the Wehrmacht was not anxious to commit excessively large forces to an adventure that it regarded as a dead end. The Nazi government was unquestionably concerned with Franco's ultimate success. But its aid in terms of manpower was still slight. According to General Spurl, 6,500 Germans arrived in Cadiz in November 1936. But this mass arrival was exceptional. The Germans never totaled much more than 10,000 men. These were often specialists and cadres. Certain officers and NCOs were singled out to train Spanish cadres, and in particular to handle the training of phalangists. A letter written by Faupel from Salamanca on December 10, 1936 confirms this. "I am asking with all urgency for the largest possible number of Spanish-speaking officers and NCOs. I am asking for Major van Issendorf to be released from his cavalry command to take over the training of the phalange. Also for retired Major von Francius of the Spanish-American Institute, Lowe to be sent as head of the infantry training school, and retired Major Sibber to take over the training of intelligence units." The arrival of these cadres, and no doubt of a few reinforcements during the course of January 1937, explains the thanks sent by Franco to Rome and Berlin. The officers in question were to serve in Spanish units. But the majority of the German technicians were together in a special formation, the Condor Legion. Organized after November 1936, when Republican resistance had intensified, it originated with the existence earlier on of a group of technicians comprising in particular anti-aircraft/artillery specialists and pilots. Berlin had agreed to send personnel but posed peremptory conditions. The German formations were to be put in the hands of a German commander, Franco's only advisor where they were concerned. A German command was in fact set up in the Hotel Maria Cristina in Seville, under Colonel Warlingham. Thus an effective force was built up, consisting mainly of aviation, a bomber group, a fighter group, and a strengthened reconnaissance unit. 3 anti-aircraft regiments, several signal units, a few detachments of Marines, and 4 armored companies, each one having 12 tanks and a company of mine detectors, joined it. It was commanded by pilots, first Spurl and then von Richthofen. Its recruitment was carefully organized. There was a headquarters W in Berlin under the Luftwaffe General Wilberg. The men of the Condor Legion were certainly detailed, but the advantages they received, good pay and the lure of adventure, often served as a decisive argument. The pilot Galland told how he had been selected for Spain, like many of his colleagues who suddenly disappeared over a period of 6 months. He was summoned to the W office, which had the job of organizing the departure of the volunteers, and provided civilian clothing, papers, and the necessary money. The pilots left in the peaceful guise of tourists sent on leave by the Work Through Joy organization. Their postal address remained Berlin. Though detailed, Galland was none the less content with his lot and seemed to find it very interesting to take part in the Civil War. Arriving in Spain, once again in military olive drab, he was finally posted to the Condor Legion. With his fighter group, he moved from one front to another according to the fighting, wherever danger was most apparent. The German pilots had nicknamed themselves Franco's firemen. Moreover, the Cottalo had recognized the importance of their aid. He made a special reference to it in a speech to the last commander of the Condor Legion, von Richthofen, at his farewell procession. The effectiveness of the German support, although it was less substantial than Italy's, was mainly accounted for by the perfect organization that ran this venture and the value of the material placed at the disposal of the Nationalist Army. Arms aid by Germany evidently went further than the equipment of the Condor Legion. In fact, a large part of the material that the Nationalists possessed was German in origin. Franco had a confidential agent in Berlin with the job of supplying all the necessary details of Nationalist Spain's arms and ammunition requirements. The equipment arrived at first through the ports of Galicia and the south controlled by the Nationalists, or else through Portugal, where the steamships Cameron and Wyatt were sighted on August 22, 1936. After the proclamation of the embargo on arms for Spain, there was even talk of sending them through Holland. But such detours were very involved, whereas the German government had been informed of the urgency of the Nationalists' needs. It is material superiority that will carry the day, Volkers was writing by September 1936. Accordingly, the ammunition ships took a more direct route. Though, according to General Spurl, in November 1936 there was only one squadron of Junkers 52 bombers, one of Heinkel He-51 fighters, one of Heinkel seaplanes, and one battery of 88 mm anti-aircraft guns, they were later joined by air groups, 4 squadrons of 12 bombers each, a fighter group of equal size, and 12 reconnaissance planes, companies of engineers, heavy anti-aircraft batteries, and searchlight units. This force, very useful in the early months of the war, became inadequate when Russian material began to reach the Republicans. The first German planes were slow, and the Civil War fighting exposed their defects in comparison to the Russian planes, or even the Italian Savola Marchettis. However, shortly after Galland's arrival in Spain, at the beginning of May 1937, new planes arrived from Germany. The bombers were Heinkel I Sandornier 17s, and the fighters, which gave the Nationalists overall air superiority, were the fastest and most easily handled planes used in the conflict, Messerschmitt 109s, which reappeared during the Polish and French campaigns. HISMA German material and munitions continued to be sent to Spain throughout the war, except during the brief period of the Czechoslovak crisis in September-October 1938. An actual business firm had been set up by the Germans, who took the opportunity of giving the Spanish affair a degree of profitability. Hitler, of course, directed operations personally and took the important decisions, as Mussolini did in Italy. But, once the orders were given, their execution was in the hands of the foreign organization, the Auslandsorganisation. Admiral Canaris, head of the AWARE, that is, the German intelligence services, took charge of it, but it was a member of the Auslandsorganisation, Johannes Bernhard, a businessman living in Morocco, who played the leading role in Spain. To make German aid to Franco easier, Bernhard formed a transport company, the Compañía Hispano-Marroquí de Transportes, HISMA Limited for short, whose first operation on August 2nd was to transport Moroccan troops to Spain. Corresponding to HISMA, operating in Spain, was an export firm set up in Germany with the help of General Goering, Ro A.K. The establishment of the Hizmero-AK tandem meant that a mass of overly obvious transactions and movements by the representatives of Franco and Mola in Berlin could be avoided. From now on, every shipment of material passed through these companies. Hizma in particular forwarded war material landed in Lisbon and the nationalist ports. But the traffic soon increased beyond the scope of mere shipments of material, and the firm never stopped growing. In October 1936, von Agwitz, Göring's confidential agent, who ran Row AK for the Auslandsorganisation, set up office in 12 rooms of the Columbus House in Berlin. Thus, there was a fleet at the organization's disposal. The power of this firm and Binhardt's real authority in Berlin as well as in nationalist circles enabled the Hizma representative in Spain to act in the best interests of Germany. One of the Berlin government's constant worries was in fact to make Franco recognize the debts that Burgos owed. In October 1937, von Storer reckoned up the monetary losses incurred by Germany until then, in order to present the bill to the nationalist government. The costs incurred by the Germans are calculated at 90 million marks, plus a bill of 70 million marks for supplies to Spain. Toward the end of the war, Undersecretary Weissacker again reckoned up the costs involved. It was no longer a question of losses incurred by individuals, but of the expense of maintaining the Condor Legion up to November 1938 as well. On the one hand, the cost of personnel, 75 million Reichsmarks, and on the other, the cost of material and equipment far greater, since it totaled more than 190 million Reichsmarks. It seems certain that this estimate was still well below the true figure, because a note from Sabbath stated that the total expenditure rose to as much as 500 million Reichsmarks. Berlin was as yet only asking for a recognition of debts. The Germans intended to be paid, but not necessarily in money. Besides, in 1939, nationalist Spain was incapable of paying back the sums owed to Italy and Germany. All that she could do, and she did it for Berlin, was to accept the principle of repayment by annual installments. It is notable that in this respect Germany received greater satisfaction than Italy. In reality, Berlin's aspirations were both vaguer and broader. It was a question of the restoration of Germanism in Spain. A note by von Storer on April 14, 1939 drew up the balance of German infiltration into Spain. Police agreement, cultural agreement of January 1939, which assured both parties of considerable advantages. Establishment of cultural institutes enjoying financial subsidies. German schools in Spain that could issue diplomas equivalent to secondary schools in Germany. Cultural cooperation fixed by exchanges of students, professors, and teachers, and exchange of radio broadcasts and films, but with an added guarantee that certain literary works banned for political reasons in one country would be banned in the other. This positive record must also include the promise of preferential treatment for Germans returning to Spain to take up their work again, the Spanish-German Friendship Treaty to which we shall have occasion to return, and Spain's membership in the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was a joint success for Germany and Italy. From the economic point of view, there was no treaty during the entire war that governed the exchange rates between Spain and Germany. The only existing agreement expired at the end of 1936 and was renewed only for a year. In such conditions, all the negotiations that took place were based on a single document, very general in scope and significance, the July 15, 1937 Protocol. The latter, signed by Ambassador Faupel and Minister Jordana, explained that both governments have a genuine desire to help each other in the provision of raw materials, foodstuffs, and manufactured and semi-manufactured goods of special interest to the importing country. Similarly, both governments will take note as far as possible of the other's interests where exports are concerned. All this remained very vague. Spain was mainly concerned with maintaining her balance of payments through the export of agricultural produce to Germany. German nationalist mining agreements, the problem to which Berlin attached the most importance was that of the German-financed mining companies in Spain, which were supposed to send essential raw materials to Germany for her war industry. Since the beginning of the Civil War, the Germans had been interested in the mineral resources, copper, tungsten, and bronze, of Spain and Spanish Morocco. In January 1937, it was pointed out that the Zeghangen iron ore mines, near Melilla, were being worked by German staff. The occupation of the Rio Tinto copper mines and the conquest of Asturias made the handling of Spanish or the chief concern of the German authorities in Spain. On January 20, Faupel wrote that Hizma had been promised that it would receive up to 60% of the output of the Rio Tinto copper mines. At the beginning of 1938, Bernhard compiled a record of mining exports to Germany during the past year that showed that more than 2,500,000 tons had been sent, including 1,600,000 tons of iron, or some of it already coming from Bilbao. These figures were substantial ones. However, to be sure of maintaining them, Berlin not only needed a Spanish promise about exports, but control over production by the Germans themselves. It was to this end that Bernhard was instructed to negotiate, on behalf of HISMA, the establishment and financial control of mining development companies. However, this time, German economic infiltration ran into serious resistance. The obstacle was a decree on October 9, 1937, issued under pressure from a group of Spanish technicians and financiers. This decree annulled the mining concessions granted since the beginning of the Civil War. Officially, its aim was to denounce the concessions made by the authorities in Valencia. In reality, Germany was the target. The law prohibited foreigners from having more than a 30% financial interest in the mining companies. Possibly this decision should be seen in the light of the overtures made to nationalist Spain at the same period by the Anglo-Saxon countries. Before the war, England received the lion's share of Spanish ore. Germany then appealed to the nationalist sense of friendship. "We are caught up," Bernhard said in his report, "in an economic war. We are justified in expecting immediate supplies from Spain." The end in view was the forming of a HISMA Montefia pirate firm, with the task of acquiring all or part of the shares in mining companies, whereby Germany would control their development. "We must," said Bernhard, "put our diplomatic, military, and cultural influence at the disposal of a single end, economic ascendancy." On October 12, 1937, the HISMA officials protested against the decree on the mining companies. This was the beginning of a series of diplomatic moves to obtain a share of at least 50% in these firms. An initial meeting took place on October 20 between Jordana and two delegates from HISMA, Pask and Klingenberg. The Spanish rejected the parity of reciprocal treatment requested by the Germans. A conversation took place on November 3, 1937 between Bernhard and the Secretary-General Nicolas Franco. Two sops were offered. First, a promise from the Burgos government that the demands made by HISMA would be examined upon the formation of a genuine government. And secondly, the advice that an immediate request should be made to the Burgos junta to obtain authorization to carry on with mining operations already in hand. Moreover, that this request would be favorably received. But Spanish-German relations had at this point entered a difficult phase. It was impossible, even for the ambassador von Storer, to obtain firm promises from the Generalissimo. Besides, difficulties were being created by the entry of German goods into Spain, and import licenses were being refused. Goering, supporter of strong-arm methods, then talked of sending von Jagwitz to Salamanca in order to point a pistol at Franco's chest. In fact, the prolongation of the war and Franco's material needs enabled Berlin to acquire in the long run what it had been unable to obtain at once. Henceforth, negotiations were handled simultaneously by Bernhard on behalf of HISMA OAK, and by the new ambassador Jan Storer, qualified for such a job by his past, a brilliant man but in the tradition of conspiratorial diplomats. The joint move, which they made on December 20 to the Generalissimo, proved that HISMA and Reich representation are one and the same thing. Franco's attitude during this meeting was not very encouraging. "I am amazed," he said, "that HISMA, which I have instructed to regulate trading and payments, is also trying to acquire mining rights, and acquire them secretly." Nevertheless, he agreed to the establishment of a mixed commission to study cases. Finally, new legislation for mines in June 1938 gave the Germans satisfaction. Foreign ownership of the capital of Spanish mining companies was fixed at a maximum of 40%, and the possibility of an increase was not out of the question. "The law," said Bernhard, "makes it entirely possible for us to take part in the mining of the Spanish subsoil as we wished." However, the decree was drawn up in such a way that it depended wholly on the goodwill of the Spanish for the Germans to be able to obtain the majority or the parity that they requested in the mining firms. Bernhard then proposed that 20% of this capital should be open to public subscription and reacquired by Spanish figureheads in HISMA Montefia. Naturally, this solution could only work if the government agreed to close its eyes. Threats to suspend deliveries of arms and munitions were enough to make the nationalists give way. since their supplies of material were completely dependent on Rome and Berlin. In November 1938, 5 anonymous companies obtained Hisma Montefia mining rights. According to the terms of the law, Germany had the right to 40% of the shares. In fact, an increase in German holdings was provided for, which could, in the Aralar company for instance, amount to as much as 35% of the capital. At the same time, in view of the fact that the mining law was applicable only on the Spanish mainland and not in Morocco, Hisma Montefia bought large holdings in the Rif mining development companies, and the nationalist government agreed to guarantee the establishment of a company called Mauritania, with its registered offices in Tetuan, which was to be exclusively German. Spanish-German economic negotiations also led to other substantial advantages, which Hisma obtained by means of various firms which it assumed control of. A special role was entrusted to Nova, which was not only given the job of constructing the Spanish broadcasting network, but also contemplated playing an important part in Spain's post-war economic reconstruction, in aerial weaponry, army equipment, troopships, economic defense tasks, increased Spanish exports to Germany, and investments and supplies of machinery. This was the record of the economic progress achieved. Berlin had spent a lot of money and had made a large material contribution, but while part of this material was recoverable, the rest was altogether too obsolete to be of any use to the Wehrmacht. In the end, the lessons learned from the fighting and the fact that mining products essential to German rearmament were arriving and continued to arrive throughout the World War largely compensated for the expenses incurred. Membership in the Anti-Comintern Pact politically, the results were less satisfying. Yet 2 agreements had been signed. The first was the March 20, 1937 Protocol, which seemed to be largely inspired by the Spanish-Italian Agreement. In it can in fact be found consultations on problems of common political concern, the principle of non-aggression, and the idea of benevolent neutrality in the event of war with a third power. But the Civil War had ended before a genuine friendship treaty was signed, to remain in force for 5 years beginning March 31, 1939, and couched in terms that were far more solid and precise than the 1937 Protocol. There was, however, no question of an unconditional alliance. On March 27, 1939, a protocol had been signed in Burgos by the ambassadors of Italy, Germany, and Japan, as well as by Jordana, then foreign minister in the nationalist government. Nationalist Spain joined the Anti-Comintern Pact. As Mussolini had hoped in 1937, she entered the Axis' system of alliances. Whatever wrangles and difficulties might have arisen among the Allies, a financial and moral debt now bound Franco to his partners. Chapter 15. Russian aid and the international brigades. To the Russians, as to the Italians and Germans, Spain had been a testing ground. The test had been mainly one of material. They had succeeded in gaining precious information about the value of their arms compared to those of the fascist powers, Russian rados compared to Messerschmitts, for instance. They had learned valuable lessons from the experience of war, the use of artillery barrages, the need for maneuver in depth in a manner adapted to new fighting techniques, and the use of guerrillas against an organized army. A large number of Russian army cadres had enjoyed a highly informative stay in Spain. On the other hand, it should be pointed out right away that without the contribution of Russian material, Republican resistance could not have continued beyond 1936. Stalin's Russia and the Spanish Civil War, this indispensable aid, however, was never adequate. The Republican troops continued to be short of air equipment, anti-aircraft weapons, and even small arms throughout the entire conflict. With this in mind, it is impossible to present as a wholehearted attempt at solidarity help that for a long time had been enough to carry on the struggle, but that, had it been more generous, would undoubtedly have tipped the scales conclusively in favor of Republican Spain. This fact has even prompted politicians and especially former Spanish communists to attribute an extraordinary Machiavellianism to the Russian leaders, lastly crediting Stalin's policy with a simplicity and continuity that were persistently contradicted by the facts during this period. Without considering any problems but those raised by the Spanish conflict, it is possible to distinguish 3 successive attitudes in the USSR's policy during this period. First, a de facto position of neutrality, accompanied by clear-cut evidence of sympathy and solidarity. After October 1936, a substantial contribution in military aid, with a correspondingly vigorous attitude in favor of the Republic on the Non-Intervention Committee. Finally, after summer 1938, a gradual slowing down of military aid, ending in the total abandonment of the Republic. Initial neutrality during the early months of the conflict, the USSR refused to intervene on the side of the Spanish Revolution. In fact, Stalin's government had no reason either to encourage or to aid the revolutionary organizations, the CNTFAI and the POUM, whose role was vital at that stage, and which did not have any particular sympathy for the Russian political regime. Furthermore, there were still no diplomatic relations between the USSR and Spain. There was talk of opening them, but 5 years of a republic had not been enough to produce even so slender a result. Finally, Spain was in Stalin's view only a very minor element in a disturbing international situation. Russia did not wish to be involved in any conflict. She was afraid of isolation and was still caught up in memories of the pre-war years, which, with the failure of the revolution in Hungary and Germany, had aligned the Western powers against Bolshevism. Renouncing the spread of world revolution, with Stalin the USSR was trying to build socialism in one country, and at the same time protect herself by a system of foreign alliances. Hitler's accession to power was a direct threat. The conclusion of the Franco-Soviet, Laval-Stalin, pact in 1934 was a riposte, a first step toward security. Yet this alliance remained tenuous and could not be regarded as effective unless it extended to Great Britain, which did not seem altogether taken with the idea. The Leon Blum government's vacillating attitude and its eventual position of cautious neutrality were not exactly calculated to encourage Stalin to embark on a hazardous adventure in Spain. Thus, when the non-intervention campaign was launched, the USSR joined it without hesitation. On August 31, the decree, banning the export, the re-export, and the shipment to Spain of all types of arms, munitions, war material, planes, and warships was made public in Moscow, as well as in the West. As it turned out, this decree was respected for only a month at the most. In mid-October, Russian material loaded on Russian and foreign ships was already beginning to arrive in Spain. The turning point in autumn 1936, there had thus been a first turning point, due to various factors that had all ultimately conspired to modify Russian policy in the same direction. Initially, there was the general emotion that the nationalist pronunciamiento and the popular reaction aroused in the world, and more particularly in left-wing circles in Western countries. It seemed impossible that the country of socialism should hold aloof from the general move to help Spain, at the risk of losing many of her foreign supporters. It was said over and over again that the leaders of the Western communist parties, and especially Maurice Thérèse, were echoing the misgivings of the militants at the imminent defeat of the Spanish Popular Front, which, after the failure of left-wing forces in Italy and Germany, had inspired them with great hope. But most important, the Spanish conflict had become too widespread for the Moscow government to remain in the wings, in spite of the moderation it had shown. The intervention of the Nazis, and especially of the Italian fascists, was too obvious. General Franco's victory would look to everyone like their victory, and consequently like the failure of the USSR's policy, the more so as Russian intervention was striving at that time to appear in the eyes of the London and Paris governments as a move in support of the European status quo, for the sake of democracy and peace. It is also perhaps advisable to indicate a reason deriving from domestic policy. The Spanish epoch was diverting the attention of part of the militant opinion in the USSR from the purges aimed at Stalin's enemies. Furthermore, under cover of aid to Republican Spain, it would be possible to ask the Russian workers for an extra effort to raise production, which could not fail to contribute toward the achievement of the objectives set by the 5-year plan of 1933. Be that as it may, the decision to intervene in Spain had been announced at the beginning of September, according to Krivitsky, at a conference of senior officials in Lubyanka, attended by Orlov, who was one of the all-powerful official representatives of Stalin's police in Spain. Since this decision was contrary to the principles affirmed by the USSR and the other powers on the non-intervention committee, it had to remain as discreet as possible. Private firms had been formed by the beginning of the same month to handle the purchase and transport of arms from Russia via Odessa to Spain. Material aid shipments followed each other between October 1936 and February-March 1937, at the rate of 30 to 40 ships of varying tonnages per month. Consignments of clothes and foodstuffs, substantial even before October, increased with the considerable growth in the activities of the Internal Committee for Aid to the Spanish people. The USSR sent some gasoline and trucks, which the non-intervention agreement did not in fact prohibit, but mainly arms and planes. More than 50% of the planes used by the Republicans between August 1936 and April 1937 came from the USSR. According to an American State Department document, March 25, 1937, Out of 460 Republican planes, there were 200 Russian fighters, 150 Russian bombers, and 70 Russian reconnaissance planes. They were mainly Katyusha bombers and I-15 and I-16 fighters, superior to the early German planes, but far inferior to the Messerschmitts. Almost all the tanks were also of Russian origin. The 12 and 18-ton tanks were fast and well armed. However, there were not enough of them, and most of the time they were mishandled, although they were at least as valuable as the enemy's tanks from Germany and Italy. Artillery, which was in short supply, consisted mainly of 76mm field guns and heavy guns, which the Republican Army lacked. Moreover, not all the material coming from Russia was brought by Russian ships, nor was it necessarily Russian material. Neither was it always of the best quality. President Aguirre mentioned rifles dating back to the Crimean War, and Krivitsky, referring to purchases made in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and even Germany, spoke of old but useful material. There was nothing remarkable about this. The French material that crossed the frontier during the early weeks was also old and sometimes in poor condition. Spain was not merely a testing ground for new weapons. She also provided the means of selling off old material that was cluttering up military supply dumps at a good price. It should not be forgotten that there was a commercial aspect to this traffic. The USSR did not give away its arms to Spain, any more than Germany did to Franco. From the earliest negotiations, it had been assumed that the Bank of Spain would finance these supplies. The dispatch of most of Spain's gold to Russia later gave rise to violent controversies among the Republican leaders. Today, they can be boiled down to one question. Did responsibility for the operation rest solely on Negrin, Minister of Finance at the time, or did he share it with others, Largo Caballero, the Premier, and Prieto, Minister of War? At the time of the nationalist advance on Madrid, a cabinet meeting decided to place the Bank of Spain's gold in safekeeping. An initial transfer took place from Madrid to Cartagena. On October 25, 1936, the gold, estimated at 510,079,529 grams, was sent to Odessa under the surveillance of 4 Spanish officials. Prieto had saddled Negrin with responsibility for this consignment. Álvarez del Valle replied that the decision had been taken by Largo Caballero and Negrin, and that Prieto had been in the know. It is certain in any case that the initial transfer to Cartagena had been made with the approval of the ministers, and it is hardly likely that so important a decision as the departure of Spain's gold could have been taken without the Premier's agreement. The dispatch of the gold to Russia came at the time when Russian aid was greatest. It is more than likely that a large part of it was in fact used to pay for arms purchases abroad. Moreover, the traffic created by the Spanish Civil War was far from negligible for a modest export trade such as Soviet Russia's. Spain became her second-best customer, and the turnover in this trade was 20 times what it was before the war. Naturally, this traffic was very difficult to conceal. The length of the crossing meant that convoys could easily be spotted, and Italian submarines had no trouble observing their movements through the central Mediterranean. Russia's aid provided Germany and Italy with an excuse to counterattack on the Non-Intervention Committee and to try to set the USSR at odds with the Western countries. It also enabled England to maintain a fictional neutrality, by claiming that she was thereby preserving an equal balance between the two belligerents. Stalin was afraid of finding himself isolated in diplomatic talks, as too often happened to his representatives on the committee. On the other hand, after Franco's reverses at Madrid, hopes of a rapid nationalist victory had vanished. The prolongation of the war was probably favorable to the policy of the USSR, which saw the Spanish conflict as a running sore that was diverting part of the German and Italian forces. This explains both the continuation of and the reduction in Russian aid. Moreover, the application of maritime control measures by the powers on the Non-Intervention Committee hampered the arrival of material and led to a definite falling off of consignments by spring 1937. The USSR, which did not have large naval resources and was not anxious to commit them rashly, refused to take part in the control but as a consequence found Republican Spain's Mediterranean coasts guarded by German and Italian warships. Finally, after December 1936, in order to change the measures for restricting the arms trade to Spain into a virtual blockade, Italy resorted to actual piracy against Russian ships and any ships that might be transporting war material from Russia. The first ship to be torpedoed in these circumstances seems to have been the Komsomol, although it is hard to tell if responsibility for it should be attributed to the Spanish nationalists equipped with submarines or to the Italian Navy itself. Russian aid. Men, while it is necessary to stress the reduction in Russian aid starting in 1937, it must also be remembered that, no matter how restricted it was, it had enabled the Valencia government to continue its resistance. On different occasions, even during 1938, and especially during the Battle of Aragon, Russian material represented the only substantial outside aid. This fact alone could suffice to explain the immense influence won by Russian advisors over the political and military development of Loyalist Spain. It also enabled her enemies to accuse Negrin of being Russia's agent. The premier had made a political choice and justified himself by refusing to fall out with the only state that was at that time supplying substantial aid to Spain. Mention must also be made of the work of nationalist propaganda, which had systematically inflated Russian aid. Even ignoring certain gross exaggerations, it was not uncommon to hear talk on the nationalist side of thousands of men sent to Spain. What is actually remarkable is the numerical weakness of the Russian troops in Spain. In 1939, Brasilac and Bardèche estimated that there had never been more than 500 of them. Others, such as Krivitsky and Catel, conceded slightly larger figures. At any rate, the Russians had never totaled more than 1,000, mainly specialists, tank crews, and airmen, retaining, like the Germans on the nationalist side, their own command and installations at a distance from the civilian population. This, of course, left the role of the Russian technicians. The diplomats, first of all, were, it seems, genuinely devoted to the Spanish cause, but nearly all of them had been recalled during 1937 and had disappeared afterwards, imprisoned or executed. Among those who had disappeared were Marcel Rosenberg, the USSR's first ambassador to Madrid, Antonov Ovsienko, consul in Barcelona, Stashevsky, the commercial attaché who negotiated the arms deliveries, and Mikhail Koltsov, as though the idea were that no one should survive who could testify to this political intervention, unless it was that their disappearance had seemed a necessary prelude to the abandonment of Spain. With the diplomats or immediately after them came the military advisors, numerous and influential but little known, whose true identities were only rarely disclosed. Generals Gurev, organizer of the defense of Madrid, who aroused nothing but sympathy in those who were close to him, Grigorovich, Douglas, commander of the airmen, Pavlov, commander of the tank crews, and Kolya, who commanded the sailors. Among them, under borrowed names, were some of the great military leaders of the 1939 to 1945 war. A first group had arrived on August 28 with Rosenberg, another in September, and a third in October. The generals are always changing, Koltsov told Regier. They come to learn their trade, and since defeats are more instructive than victories, they do not remain long. It seems at any rate that apart from the headquarters where the Russian mission worked, all the top Republican leaders had had at least one Russian technical advisor on their staffs. All had been under constant supervision from agents of the NKVD, the all-powerful political police, in Spain under Orlov. The NKVD must also be credited with a large number of foreign communist militants who came from Russia with the Comintern apparatus, such as Gero and a few others, whose activities were more police ones than political or military. Low. The first international volunteers apart from Russian troops, there were foreign communists trained in the Soviet Union who played a vital role in the organization and officering of the international brigades, because there were practically no Russians in the brigades except, paradoxically, white Russians. Two, in fact, along with intervention by foreign troops on the side of the Spanish Republic, the aid that came from outside was in the long run merely the result of a large number of individual contributions. In contrast to what happened on the nationalist side, where the German and Italian leaders prepared and organized the dispatch of armed contingents, no government, except that of the USSR, we have seen to what extent played a vital part in the struggle on the Republican side. However, it was mainly on the Comintern's initiative that it was possible to organize this aid. No doubt, during the early months of the war, at the time of the revolutionary militias, a small number of foreigners had come of their own accord to fight in the Republican ranks. Foreigners already living in Spain, such as the Italian socialist De Rosa, or who had been there for one reason or another when the uprising occurred, such as those taking part in the Spartacus Games in Barcelona, who had immediately supported the Catalan workers. This was how the first groups of foreign volunteers were formed, and they were joined by Italian, German, French, and Belgian anti-fascist militants from France. This was also true of the small group that formed on the Northern Front and which took part in the defense of Iran, Germans from the Thelman Centuria, Italians from the Rosselli Column, French from the Commune de Paris Centuria, Italians from the Gaston Sazzi Centuria who defended Madrid on the Sierra, and foreigners who joined the Durruti Column. But the first instance of a sizable organization was the International Air Force established by André Malraux. The España Squadron made a huge contribution, at least in the early months of the war, at a time when the government's bomber force was completely non-existent in spite of their small number of planes. About 20 the men of the International Brigade were the only ones whose actions had some effect, especially with the bombing of the nationalist column in Medellin, which, as its head pointed out, was the only operation carried out in the grand manner by the Republicans during the first part of the war. In the same way, their fighter force, some 40 planes, effectually relieved the Republican Air Force, which only had some old brigates. Yet these improvised squadrons could not contend with the more modern and of course faster German and Italian planes. The España Squadron completed its final mission with an attempt to protect the retreat from the machine guns of the enemy fighters. The International Brigades in November 1936, the first Russian planes that could bear comparison with the enemy's, appeared. It was also in November that the International Brigades were committed to the Spanish front. Whatever their political views, journalists and writers have always stressed the influence of the commitment of the International Brigades on the stiffening of Republican resistance. They formed a corps d'élite involved in all fighting of any importance until the end of 1938. On November 7th they were in Madrid, and on the 13th they took part in the fighting on the Cerro de Los Angeles. In December they turned up in Teruel and Lopera on the Cordova front. In February-March 1937 they fought on the Jarama, at Malaga, and at Guadalajara. They were later involved in all the major offensives at Brunit and Belchite, at Teruel, and finally at the Battle of the Ebro, where they took part in the last Republican offensive. The decisive role they played in all the theaters of the war may have given rise to the belief in the existence of a numerically very substantial force. There is talk in Spain, even today, of hundreds of thousands of foreign volunteers in the brigades. Without its being possible always to determine figures and to go into fighting conditions, a more serious study reveals infinitely lower numbers. Who were these combatants? Where did they come from? How were they prepared and launched into battle? At the start, it seems only individuals enlisted in the Republican militias. Then the foreigners gradually regrouped in separately organized units. These combatants were anti-fascists, mainly Germans and Italians, expelled from their countries by the Hitler and Mussolini regimes, who chose this occasion to renew their struggle against the dictators, but also some Frenchmen, numerous because of the proximity of the country, the ease of crossing the frontier, and the natural rapprochement that existed between the two countries where the Popular Front had just triumphed. In fact, these individual enlistments could not have had a serious bearing on the balance of military forces and, more often, merely added yet another heterogeneous element to an already very ill-assorted army. By the end of September, aid to Spain had its first taste of organization, especially in the recruitment and dispatching of volunteers. The governing cell was recruited from leaders of the French Communist Party and Italian political refugees. The committee in charge of recruitment was, according to Longo, run by Giulio Soretti, known as Allard. Another communist, Josip Broz, later Marshal Tito, organized the dispatching of volunteers from Central Europe. Luigi Longo, known as Gallo, shared responsibility with the French Communist Party apparatus for getting the volunteers across. A large number had already passed through the organized channels by October 22nd, when the brigades were officially born. At the beginning of the month, a delegation made up of 3 communists, an Italian, Longo, a Pole, Wisniewski, and a Frenchman, Ribier, was received by Azana and later by Largo Caballero. The 3 men were finally sent to Martinez Barrio, who was in charge of organizing the first brigades of the Republican Army. Agreement was easily reached, and thus it was that the first international brigades appeared in November 1936. Recruitment of the brigades, of course, recruitment remained an individual matter. The volunteers from all countries assembled in France, after which they arrived in small groups across the Pyrenean frontier. In fact, in spite of the diversity of the organizations in charge of enrollment, enlistment took place in offices established on the premises of trade union organizations or left-wing parties. It was the Communist Party that had overall control of the operation. It was also in charge of the dispatching of the volunteers as far as Spain. Moreover, there were no obstacles to crossing the frontier, even though it was officially prohibited. In Perpignan there was actually a barracks for the international volunteers, who moved freely about the town. In February alone, more than 35 trucks crossed the frontier without running into difficulties. Moreover, the French Communist Party had duplicated the frontier convoys by means of boats that, under cover of a shipping company, France Navigation, transported the volunteers. Longo, referring to the first volunteers, stated that 500 came through Figueres and 500 from Marseilles to Alicante on the Ciudad de Barcelona. Delegations for the brigades were set up in all large Spanish towns to welcome the newcomers. But, while the question of transit was thus solved, the organization of the original force, as constituted by an international army of volunteers, raised special problems. It is very difficult, as we saw, to determine with any precision how many men were in the brigades. Most of the documents have disappeared and even former leaders cannot agree on the figures. Without doubt, the most common tendency is to exaggerate them. The fascist countries have tried systematically to inflate the numbers of what they called Red Volunteers, and the anti-fascist parties and national groups have themselves tended to present their contribution as greater than it actually was. According to Victor Alba, in June 1937 there were 25,000 French, 5,000 Poles, 5,000 English and Americans, 3,000 Belgians, 2,000 Balkaners, and 5,000 Germans and Italians, making a total of at least 30,000. Taking into account the continual coming and going, and the fact that the volunteers kept arriving until the beginning of 1938, a total figure of fewer than 5,000 men can hardly be advanced. In practice, this figure is probably greater than the true one. If the number of men in a brigade is calculated at a maximum of 3,500, since the brigades were rarely at full strength, this makes a total figure of 30,000. And probably even this was not attained. Malraux's opinion is that the total number of volunteers did not exceed 25,000 men. This is also the view, a very well-founded one, of Vidal Gaiman. According to him, there were never more than 15,000 men in action at any one time, of whom about some 10,000 were combatants, at the point when the brigades were at their greatest strength, in the spring and summer of 1937. This number later fell. Casualties were heavy. The number killed was about 2,000, and many of the volunteers, wounded, weary, or disheartened, left without being replaced by the same number of new arrivals. Of this total of 25,000, the French were unquestionably the most numerous, although their fighting quality was often inferior to that of the German or Italian contingents, recruited from émigrés who had already paid for fighting for the cause in their native lands with exile. As the result of an economic crisis that had shaken Europe and whose repercussions could still be felt in spite of an economic recovery stimulated by the manufacture of war material, there was still a lump-end proletariat in France that enlisted to fight in Spain for not always disinterested motives. This explains certain statements made in France to the pro-nationalist press by men who left without being very sure of themselves and who were quickly disheartened by the severity of the fighting. The number of French volunteers also varied the most, along with opinions of their conduct. The 14th and 14th A brigades were mainly French, but there were other Frenchmen in the Commune de Paris Battalion in the 11th Brigade, the Franco-Belgian Battalion in the 12th Brigade, and the Henri Villemin Battalion in the 13th Brigade. Once again, a classification of this sort is difficult, because these battalions were constantly being reshuffled and integrated with new units, according to the needs of the moment or the causalities incurred. The work carried out by the Association of Volunteers for Republican Spain to try to discover the exact strength of the brigades showed about 1/3 of the volunteers as French, certainly fewer than 10,000 men and often confused with the Belgian volunteers. To this Franco-Belgian group may be added a Polish one, mainly recruited from the mining areas of France and Belgium. Thanks to their contribution, the total number of Poles who fought in Spain was certainly more than 4,000 men. Another substantial contingent of volunteers was supplied by German and Italian émigrés. They played an especially important role in the officering of the brigades. Among them were some political cadres, mainly communists. The Italians and Germans sent nearly all their leaders, the socialist Pietro Nenni, the communists Luigi Longo, Gallo, and Di Vittorio Nicoletti, and the Republican Paciardi among the Italians, the Austrian socialist Julius Deutsch, and the German communists Hans Beimler and Franz Delem. Other countries sent few national leaders, with the exception of André Marty, but many middle-level cadres and, especially in the case of the French, leaders of the communist youth. This leaves the volunteers from the Anglo-Saxon countries, the English, Canadians, and Americans in the Lincoln Battalion, a few hundred men of each nationality. From Central Europe, mainly Yugoslavs, but also Hungarians, Czechs, Bulgarians, and even Albanians, arriving by every known means, even on foot. Others came from even further afield, from Asia and Africa. Altogether, 53 countries were represented in the brigades. The senior cadres, like the troops, were of all nationalities, French and Italian of course, but also Germans, Hungarians, and Poles. The officers with the most important posts were more often than might be expected of Central European origin. The communists were in the majority, which made a Nenni or a Pacciardi stand out all the more. Many of them had fought in the Great War, some had been regular officers, and others had received their military training in Moscow. Sometimes they had undergone both kinds of training, such as Hans Kehl, Lieutenant Colonel Hans, Wilhelm Zeisser, General Gomez, the Hungarian Matazalka, General Lukács, the Pole Karol Swierczewski, General Walter, all combatants in the Great War who had become communist militants and had sometimes taken courses at military academies in the USSR. The same was true of some former combatants with more limited political responsibilities, the Frenchman Dumont, the German writer Ludwig Renn, Gustav Regier, and the Hungarian Colonel Gál, Béla Kun's one-time companion. And of the most mysterious and most famous of all the leaders of the international brigades, General Kleber, whom many contemporaries regarded as the hero of Madrid's defense. The base at Albacete. The first problem facing the organizers of the brigades was to give a certain unity to such heterogeneous forces in order to integrate them into the Spanish army later on. The volunteers, on arriving in Spain, had to find assembly and training centers, which would enable them to be split up according to their origins and their abilities. It was to perform this role that the center in Albacete was initially set up. The town had not been chosen at random. The 5th Regiment, in fact, already had a base there. Longo, helped by Vidal, Major Carlos, had got ready the premises that were to receive the first men of the international brigades. A headquarters was improvised there that, with the collaboration of the Spanish, had mainly to procure the necessary material for quartering and feeding the men who were arriving in ever greater numbers. Everything was not perfect in the early days, and they were even short of water for washing. Gradually, however, the most urgent problems were solved. The Albacete headquarters, composed mainly of Frenchmen, worked in constant liaison with the Spanish military authorities. The men of the international brigades were sent wherever the danger was most pressing, at the request and on the orders of the Spanish command. Naturally, the duality of power between military command and commissariat, familiar in the popular army, was met with again at Albacete. Military questions fell within the scope of the French officers, especially Vidal Gaiman, Major Vidal, and the political leadership was in the hands of Di Vittorio, Longo, and, in particular, André Marti. The latter owed this crucial post of leader of men to his career as a militant and to his reputation as an old revolutionary. But the man who had long been the Black Sea mutineer, and no doubt a victim of his own legend, became, to many of his detractors, the butcher of Albacete. Even inmost of his crimes are to be believed, it must be admitted that this pugnacious old grumbler was not the ideal leader for such a composite troop. However, Gaiman stated that he never departed from his political functions and meddled neither with the appointment of officers nor with the handling of operations. The base rapidly ceased to be merely a reception center for freedom fighters. On the one hand, it became a mobilization center for units at the front or in the process of being constituted, and on the other hand, it became a center for training and general control of the services. Training camps were set up in the neighborhood, as well as a military academy for officers and political commissars. There were many and diverse services because it contained a workshop for repairing equipment and, later, a grenade factory. There was even, for a certain time, a stockyard full of beasts abandoned at the start of the Civil War and brought from Estremadura, where they had been wandering for months. More essential, however, were the postal and transport services. Postal censorship of letters written in some 40 languages posed a complicated problem. Means of transport, almost non-existent at the start, 3 motorcycles and a few old cars, were improved. The car park was well maintained by volunteers, former Renault and Citroën workers. The health service was the most important. Of course, there were Spanish hospitals, but they were concentrated in Madrid, which caused real difficulties because of the bombing of the capital. The isolation of wounded members of the international brigades among Spaniards, whom they very often did not understand, had unfortunate repercussions on their morale. At first, they were given private rooms in Madrid hospitals. Then an attempt was made to put them together. By October 6, doctors, under Dr. Rooks and then Dr. Newman, had organized the medical service, field hospitals, ambulances, and mobile evacuation groups. A woman doctor, Strzelska, organized the Murcia International Hospital and 400 annexes in the region. Rest and convalescence centers were set up. Ambulances and medical equipment came from Paris. To finance these achievements, the volunteers temporarily gave up 2/3 of their pay. Organization of the brigades. We have dwelt here solely on the problems peculiar to the brigades, since their organization and the difficulties of arming them were the same as those of the other Republican troops. We shall merely note that, in addition to the infantry brigades, there were some international artillery groups, the Gramsci Battery, the Anna Pauker Battery, and the Skoda Battery, the oldest. As to the command, there had never been, any more than in the whole of the Republican Army, a very clear-cut distinction between the political commissar and the unit commander. The commissar's role was initially that of a supervisor. He wore a special uniform. The importance of his role varied according to his personality. It was a remarkable fact that, although the commissar at first had to devote himself mainly to human problems, especially complex in the brigades, he ended by becoming the commander's deputy, relieving him of material questions, the evacuation of the wounded, medical and postal services, and food problems. Toward the end of the war, political commissariat and command finally merged everywhere, thus re-establishing the unilateral command of classic armies, rather more clear-cut than in the rest of the Republican Army. The experienced officers who ran the brigade also made a substantial contribution to the training of Spanish soldiers, many of whom eventually served in international units. This was because they changed progressively, first by organizing themselves according to the needs of the moment and the growing number of volunteers, then because the volunteers became less and less numerous. From the outset, in the interests of training and command, the general staff of the brigades tried to group the men according to their countries of origin. It was thus that the Thalmann and Edgar André battalions were made up of Germans and a few Austrians. The Garibaldi Battalion, one of the first combatant groups, which played a decisive role at Guadalajara, was exclusively made up of Italians. However, it was not always possible to group the combatants in this way, the number of nationals from certain countries making it difficult to form homogeneous units. On the other hand, the volunteers had to be integrated as they arrived, and this could only happen in training units. In this way, the Gaston Sazzi Battalion included Italians and Poles. The 9th Battalion of the 14th Brigade was known as the Battalion of 9 Nationalities. The Italian pensionati told us about the Dimitrov Battalion, whose commander was the Bulgarian Grbenarov, and whose political commissar was the German Furman. Difficulties were even greater in the case of large units, the brigades themselves sometimes being hastily formed to go up to the front with the least possible delay. In this way, the 12th Brigade, on its formation, included a German battalion, the Thalmann Battalion, an Italian one, the Garibaldi Battalion, and a Franco-Belgian one. Later on, there was an attempt at regrouping, with the Thalmann and Edgar André battalions transferred to the 11th, and the 14th being almost exclusively made up of French battalions. The heavy casualties incurred in the early fighting speeded up this tendency, forcing the Albacete headquarters to make a complete reshuffle. By November 1936, the Commune de Paris Battalion had lost the equivalent of 2 platoons. In Teruel, between the 28th and the 31st of December 1937, the 12th Brigade lost half its men. Thus units disappeared. The Louise Michel Battalion was merged with the Henri Vuillemin after the initial clashes. Taking these reshuffles into account and relying on the table of international units compiled by the AVER, the permanent presence of 5 brigades can be established. The 11th, whose commander was Kleber and whose commissar was Beimler, the 12th, whose commander was Lukacs and whose commissar was Longo Gallo, the 13th under Zeisser Gomez, the 14th under Walter, and the 15th under Gell. Some of the international elements were merged directly with the Spanish army, while Spanish recruits were incorporated with brigades. According to Longo, this merger became necessary in March 1937. This was how the dual role of the brigades in the Republican Army emerged. With their gallantry and enthusiasm, they formed an elite troop ready to be assigned to the toughest fighting. With their capacity for resistance and their aggressiveness, they served as an example and, in some respects, as a school. Their small numbers, however, meant that they could only be committed on limited fronts. Their efforts were in vain, especially after the collapse of the North. Besides, the great international surge to the defense of the Spanish Republic in 1936 to 1937 did not reoccur. From 1937 on, the Communist parties dissociated themselves from mobilization in the name of anti-fascism. The fact remains that the brigades existed, and that they played a crucial role in several decisive battles. It is for this reason, among others, that a man like Gustave Regier, after his split with the Communist Party and the collapse of the illusions on which he had based his life as an outlaw, can, even today, rejoice wholeheartedly at the memory of the enthusiastic brotherhood of the international brigades. Chapter 16. The Conquest of the North. After the fall of San Sebastian and Iron, which deprived the northern front of any chance of getting food supplies across the French frontier, no attack of any importance was attempted against the Basque provinces. Mila's best organized forces were directed against Madrid. Neither on the Republican nor the Nationalist side were there large numbers of well-armed troops for some months. There were not enough combatants to hold a continuous front from the Bay of Biscay to Galicia. Fighting flared up in one sector, then in another. Biscay, Santander, Asturias. Their conquest, one by one, during the course of the year, marked the stages of the nationalist offensive. The northern front. It is immediately obvious that the nationalists were confronted by two areas of solid resistance, though their political regimes were diametrically opposed. The Basque provinces, conservative and Catholic, whose national aspirations had rallied them to the side of the Republic, and working-class Asturias, bastion of the revolution in October 1934 and again in July 1936. In the center, on the other hand, was an area of weakness, the Santander region, where the War Committee was faced with an insoluble problem, defending the broadest part of the front with a very small number of ill-armed troops. The brittleness of the sector was further increased by dissension between socialists and anarchists. The fact that the decisive fighting took place around Bilbao and the influence of Basque resistance and its repercussions abroad kept the simultaneous existence between these three centers hidden. However, it was the middle of 1937 before the military command was unified, adequate proof that there was no real entente even in this field. The officers sent by Caballero, Captain Sutat to Asturias and General Llano de la Encomienda to the Basque provinces, had attempted in vain to achieve unity with the help of Russian technicians. Though as militarized units their names were similar, the troops remained different. The Basque militias were uniformed units with a stiffening of chaplains, without manos and political commissars, while in the Asturian militias, parties and trade unions retained control. Not only was there no unilateral military command for the three zones, but one area was hostile to and suspicious of the next. The Asturian revolutionaries were hostile to the conservative Basques, and the Basques had reservations about the anarchism of Santander and Gijón. Already in August 1936 there were difficulties. In Asturias there was a witch hunt against priests and nuns. The churches had been destroyed or closed and worship forbidden. In the Basque provinces, on the contrary, the church still enjoyed all its freedoms and continued to have a profound influence not only on the people but also within the government, which included several Catholic ministers. The oath sworn by Aguirre stressed that the president would conduct himself as a believer, a people's magistrate, and a Basque. Priests and disciples, persecuted in Asturias, sought refuge in the Basque provinces, where CNT militants protested violently against the decree making Good Friday a feast day. In Asturias, mines and factories were controlled, and many business firms, even in minor industries, were collectivized. In the Basque provinces, property had remained untouched. Whereas the government committees were leading the revolution in Asturias, the Euskadi defense juntas were busy restoring normalidad everywhere. Few civil guards remained in Asturias except in Gijón, whereas there were plenty in Santander and the Basque provinces. After the regional powers had been integrated into the Republican state, the Asturias Council still included anarchists. There were never any in the Basque government. The Aguirre government had fought against the revolution. Though there had been a harsh purge in Asturias, the Euskadi government had set itself the objective of guaranteeing the safety of individuals and their possessions. It had disarmed the rear, with a ban on the carrying of arms applying to anyone not in the army or the police, and it acquired the right to recruit as many police forces as the situation required. It is not surprising that, in such circumstances, collaboration between the two territories in what may be called the Spanish Confederation became difficult. With no coordination achieved in the military field as long as the inferiority of the Republican forces was not yet obvious, the scattering of effort put a brake on all initiative. The Basques reproved the Asturians for not backing the operation in October against Alajua, intended to relieve Madrid. The Asturians retorted that, with munitions and a little heavy equipment, they would have taken Oviedo in October, before the Solchaga column came to its rescue. Certainly, Basque battalions took part in the major attack by the Asturians against Oviedo in February, but the calm of the rest of the northern front enabled the nationalists to contain this attack successfully. There was no collaboration in the economic field either. Yet the north was the only industrial region where conversion of factories could have established a strong war industry. But the Asturians had the coal and the Basques the iron. Precious months were lost in talks and recrimination. The central government undoubtedly strove to settle their differences. On several occasions it was suggested to Aguirre that he should admit CNT representatives to his cabinet. And the CNT leaders asked their Euskadi comrades to avoid blunders. But the North did not receive any material aid, which deprived the councils of Madrid and Valencia of any effectiveness. Caballero in Mis Recuerdos recalled anguished telegrams from Aguirre calling for air support and referred to the Basque president's despair. The Asturians also stated that they had been defeated through lack of war material. The only appreciable contribution was the arrival of Russian arms: 15 fighters, 5 field guns, 15 tanks, 200 machine guns, and 15,000 rifles dating back to the Crimean War, which was little for 35,000 soldiers and proved absurdly inadequate in the 1937 offensive. Faced with imminent danger, the attitudes of the Basques and the Asturians were radically different. The Asturian militias, like all the rest, fought badly in open country. But in street fighting they knew how to hang on to every house in the towns and villages. The struggle entered on was to them a matter of life and death, and dynamite was their supreme argument. They were not afraid of destruction and intended to leave only ruins in the hands of the nationalists. In their view, terror was the only means of holding the rear. They never hesitated to kill anyone who mentioned surrender on the spot. They were prepared to answer bombing raids with mass executions of hostages, either rebel sympathizers or simply suspects. The Basques, in similar circumstances, had very different reactions. Respectful of religious beliefs and political opinions, and anxious to behave like good Catholics, they preferred to release a guilty man rather than execute an innocent one. They retained suspect or merely half-hearted persons in key posts and were as concerned with preserving the lives of hostages captured by their neighbors as with holding the front. More important, the stakes in the war were not the same in their case. Temporary allies of the Popular Front, the leaders of the Basque Nationalist Party, their financial backers, and their troops shared neither the ideology nor the outlook of the other anti-fascist combatants. They were fighting for the Basque provinces in themselves, and for their liberties, refusing to let everything be destroyed in feudal combat. The Basque bourgeoisie knew that the future would not be wholly denied to them in the event of a nationalist victory, and that their services would be needed when the factories and mines that had escaped destruction were functioning again. They were relying on their British associates to protect them. Finally, Catholic solidarity gave them hope, if not of a compromise, at least of some consideration from the rebels, and the chance of safeguarding part at least of their interests. The struggle on two fronts had its own logic. The desire not to yield to the revolution, and not to subject the populations of towns, monuments, and industrial installations to the atrocities of street fighting and to the inevitable reprisals, induced some of the Basques to oppose, by force if necessary, the advocates of last-ditch resistance and destruction. In this task, they were sometimes outstripped by disguised phalangists and opportunists, who saw in it a means of hastening the Republican rout. The campaign. For Bilbao, the prospect of an easy victory would alone have been enough to persuade Franco to turn toward the north, after his successive failures at Madrid. But other factors were certainly operating. In the first place, the Battle of Madrid had proved that it was advisable to prepare for a long war. A Republican army was now in existence. Franco, who did not have the means to carry the day by seizing the capital, could not hope to win by a general offensive. His reserves were too weak, and the casualties incurred in the recent fighting had temporarily dispelled the idea of a war of attrition. The tactics employed until the cessation of hostilities consisted of attacking and reducing Republican Spain region by region, which meant that substantial material could be concentrated on a limited front. The isolation of the north naturally made it the ideal sector for such a venture. Moreover, the fall of the north had an economic value that could be crucial for the latter part of the war. The lion's share of the Spanish metal industry was there. Finally, its possession was important for future international negotiations. Germany, which needed Cantabrian iron or had to support such an operation. England, which used the same or could not ignore the established authority in the region, whether Republican or nationalist. General Mola was in charge of the most important operation and the easiest one to carry out, the conquest of Biscay. His troops had enjoyed a period of calm and reorganization in early 1937. For Navarrese brigades were continually in the front line during the nationalist offensive and comprised a force equal if not superior in numbers to the Basque troops, reinforced by a few brigades from Asturias and Santander, concentrated in the Sierras to protect the passes leading to Bilbao. Behind General Solchaga's Navarrese, the Italian Black Arrows, and the new March 23rd Division, formed after Guadalajara, were held in reserve. Later on, Mola reinforced his troops with units composed of Moroccans and contingents from the Tercio. The operation began, as anticipated, on 3 March, after Mola had delivered a final ultimatum to the Basques. The fighting methods that were continually employed by the nationalists during this campaign at once became clear: exploitation of overwhelming material superiority and intensive artillery barrages, followed by air attacks. Their effectiveness emerged at once from the results obtained in the first 5 days of the offensive, in spite of frequent and courageous counterattacks by the Basques. However, the occupation of the mountain passes had not brought the nationalists into contact with the Iron Ring, Bilbao's defense line. Aznar invoked the bad weather, which had certainly slowed down operations by ruling out air attacks at a crucial moment. But the Basque army, in spite of its losses and its paucity of material, was still capable of hitting back dangerously. This explains the harsh fighting around Mount Sabigan, captured and recaptured several times between the 11th and the 15th of April. At that point, what was needed was a diversion from outside, forcing Franco to switch part of his troops and air force to another sector. But efforts in this direction were, as we shall see, too late and too feebly carried out. The first stage of the Biscay campaign had been completed by the end of April with the occupation of Durango, Ibar, and Guernica. The Navarrese brigades were at last in contact with the heights that protected and dominated the Iron Ring. These last operations were notable for a massive use of planes, which terrorized and pulverized not only the defense lines but towns and villages too. The most famous incident in this respect was the destruction of Guernica on April 26 by German aircraft. This raid had tremendous repercussions abroad. Nowadays, after Rotterdam and Coventry, after the destruction of Warsaw and the atom bomb at Hiroshima, people are almost surprised by the importance attached to this attack. But this was because Guernica was the religious capital of the Basque provinces. The emotions of the Catholic world, especially in France, were greatly aroused. And then the affair had an international aspect to it, because it was the Germans who were justly accused of being responsible. The evidence of the inhabitants who fled Guernica, burned and threatened by the rebels, was irrefutable. The pilot Galland merely said that it was a regrettable mistake. But faced with public strictures and the feelings of the House of Commons, where Eden had been challenged, Germany asked Franco for a vigorous denial. Hence the nationalist version. Guernica was burned by Red Hordes. Aguirre devised a satanic plan for the destruction of Guernica, which was carried out by Asturian dynamiteros. This interpretation still holds good today in Spain. Meanwhile, the nationalist forces needed reorganization and reinforcement before attacking the fortifications of Bilbao. Faupel reported that General Franco had asked the Italians to commit the Littorio division to these crucial operations. But the latter were less enthusiastic since Guadalajara, especially since a new emergency, due to recklessness, revived unhappy memories. After the occupation of Guernica, the Black Arrows made rapid progress along the coast and reached Bermeo, leaving their left flank exposed. A Republican counterattack cut them off for a few days, and the March 23rd Division and a Navarrese brigade had to be sent to rescue them. May was spent in preparations for the decisive battle. The two adversaries strengthened their positions around the Iron Ring. The ineffectiveness of this line of fortifications, famous until it was put to the test, was to be swiftly demonstrated. It was not garrisoned by enough men, and it was dominated by heights that, once they were occupied by the enemy, made its long-term defense impossible. Also, the Republicans persisted in defending these strategic points, thereby delaying the nationalist offensive. However, Mila's replacement by Davila, who faithfully carried out Franco's orders, strengthened the unity of the nationalist command. The casualties incurred by the Basques during the counterattacks had been enormous. Finally, the plan of the Iron Ring had been handed over to the nationalists by Captain Goicoechea, which explains the remarkable accuracy of the artillery barrage that preceded the assault. Henceforth, the breaching of the fortified line was inevitable. The decisive attack began on June 12, and the Iron Ring was broken over a 2-mile front that day. The rest of the defenses were taken from the rear. The Basques, who until then had fought well, now felt that there was no way of resisting. Possibly they could have prolonged the struggle by agreeing to fight in the streets, but this would have led to the destruction of their city. By evacuating Bilbao almost without a struggle, the Basques unquestionably brought the nationalist victory nearer, but they prevented destruction that seemed pointless to them by then. Here, as at San Sebastian, two conceptions of war were at odds. The Basques did not hesitate to disarm the Asturian militias that had set up barricades in the streets of the new town. On the 16th, Colonel Bengoa fled to France. In his view, Bilbao was undergoing a genuine collapse of authority. He was afraid that, since no one was exercising any authority there any longer, the city would be unable to surrender. On the 17th, the Basque governor quit the capital, leaving a defense junta including Laizela, Aznar, Socialist, Astigarrabia, Communist, and General Ulibarri. It is very difficult to say if it had any real authority. According to Lutemps, on the evening of the 17th, shooting broke out between the Basques, in favor of surrender, and the extremists in favor of resistance to the bitter end. The anarchists blew up bridges and summarily executed some of those favoring surrender. A Basque unit of 1,200 militiamen who had been soldiers in the regular army before the war then went into action, supported by the police, the asaltos, and the civil guards. The militiamen from Santander and Asturias were attacked and disarmed, and the white flag was hoisted on the telephone exchange. Emissaries were sent to the nationalists, and Basque units occupied public buildings and restored order. The police, now wearing the Carlist beret, carried on with its work after the entry of Davila's troops. While the nationalists were occupying Bilbao, the Basque army was retreating toward the west. Almost without resistance, all the rest of Biscay fell into the hands of the nationalists. Aznar estimated the losses suffered by the Basques during the campaign at 30,000 men. However, it took the nationalist general staff 11 weeks to wind up the campaign. Natural conditions and Basque resistance are not enough to account for the length of the fighting. There were mistakes by the nationalists and, in particular, a misunderstanding between the Spaniards and the Italians. General Duria was even forced, after the setback at Bermeo, to do without the active participation of the CTV in the campaign. The diversion. Beneath, the Republicans had been unable to take advantage of the delay. A powerful attack from the central zone could have interrupted the nationalist offensive. But the two attempts at a diversion that were made from the Central Front in May and June lacked scope. They were undertaken without conviction and with inadequate means. At Balsain, in Old Castile, the attack had the immediate aim of seizing La Granja. It was not even supported by assault tanks. At Huesca, where the offensive was to have led to the occupation of the town, the attackers had only 3 batteries of artillery. In both cases, the enemy seemed to be on his guard, and the first attackers met with a lively response. The very day after the final attempt on the Huesca front, the occupation of Bilbao by the nationalists marked the end of the Biscay campaign. Of course, the struggle could have gone on longer, but it was necessary, in order to free the north, to act swiftly with a large tactical force. Meanwhile, the elimination of the revolutionary opposition had meant the creation, at least in appearance, of political unity. The Negrin government, the government of victory, was relying on an army that was progressively losing its revolutionary character and coming to resemble a regular army. The autonomous militias were disappearing. The military technicians, who had the government's confidence, were pushing the political ones into the background. In the central sector, the chief role was played by Vicente Rojo. On the northern front, Gamiru Labari, former professor at the Toledo Military Academy like Rojo, was given control of the whole of the Republican zone, thus achieving, though belatedly, unity of command in this region. At the instigation of these technicians, a total reorganization of the army was envisaged. The troops, whatever their origin and initial training, were divided into armies, army corps, brigades, and battalions. This reorganization, useful wherever a long period of calm allowed it to be completed, had little significance on the northern front, where more immediate defense tasks were imposed on the command. It was one thing to organize such army corps theoretically, but another to provide them with the capacity to resist and to prepare them for an offensive action. The men had to be instructed. The 5th Army Corps, made up chiefly of troops of the old 5th Regiment, was both example and model. It provided the first tactical force in the summer 1937 offensives. The second problem, even more awkward for the Republicans to solve, was that of arms. The provision of arms had become more and more difficult since border and sea-coast controls had come into effect on April 19. The unit's complement of heavy arms and assault tanks, which played an important part in a breakthrough, was quite inadequate. The supply of Russian planes was far from being great enough to permit a massive use of aircraft, especially attack planes. This material inferiority was less obvious around Madrid than in the other combat sectors, since the mass of organized troops had been concentrated on that part of the front during the first 3 months of 1937. This was no doubt one of the reasons that determined the choice of Broué for the large diversionary offensive launched in early July. It seems that there was a fairly serious discussion before the choice of the attack sector, which was finally made for political rather than military considerations. 2 possibilities were in fact open to the government forces. The first was an offensive in Extremadura, in the Mérida area. A glance at the map shows that the advantages of such a move were obvious. Its success would have confronted the nationalist army with its greatest danger, by directly threatening Badajoz and the Portuguese frontier and consequently severing communications with the Moroccan and southern bases. Moreover, there were far fewer forces defending this area than on the Madrid front. All these considerations had raised the possibility of an attack in this sector long before. This was the particular brainchild of Colonel Asensio Tirado, Largo Caballero's technician. During 1938, the Republican military leaders re-examined this plan, but, everything considered, it was never carried out with the means necessary to ensure its success. In the end, it was the second offensive solution that prevailed: an attack in the Madrid sector. The decision for launching a military operation of this scope lay with the government, and especially with the war minister Indalecio Prieto. The latter had insisted on personally attending the opening of the offensive against Broué. Ultimately, in agreement with the Russian technicians, Miaja and Rojo took the step of choosing the Madrid front. Rojo explained its military advantages. The nationalist forces were weaker because they had had to dispatch troops from this sector to the northern front. They were morally weakened because of their failure at the capital. But above all, the reserves of manpower were in place there. No great troop movements were necessary. The effect of surprise could be more easily achieved than on the southern front, toward which large-scale troop movements could not be long concealed. At all events, there was no question of depleting the Madrid front, symbol of Republican Spain's resistance. On the other hand, the Republican General Staff was convinced that the only way of winning was to breach the line of battle with a heavy concentration of troops and artillery, which meant an attempted breakthrough on an extremely limited front. The choice of Broué answered these imperatives. The Battle of Broué, the operation had a twofold aim: to halt the nationalist offensive in the north by forcing Franco to recall part of the forces involved in Biscay, and, in reaching the communications network of Navalcarnero by an attack to the west of Madrid, to make the nationalists withdraw to the Tagus and to isolate the troops positioned on the immediate outskirts of the capital. The success of this scheme, even if the enemy managed to avoid encirclement, would force him into a hasty retreat and relieve Madrid. In this way, all the nationalist successes would be threatened. To carry out this scheme of encirclement, a 2-pronged attack was envisaged. The major one was to bring about the capture of Broué and the occupation of the mountainous ridge overlooking Navalcarnero. The subsidiary attack's objective was a breakthrough in the direction of Alcorcón, to the south of Madrid. The main attack was entrusted to the 5th Army Corps under Modesto and to the 18th under Jurado. The best of the Republican troops were there, the Lister Division, the 13th and 15th International Brigades. The subsidiary attack was led by the Madrid Reserves, including the Kleber and Duran Divisions and the 2nd Army Corps under Romero. The means allotted to the Republican General Staff were the greatest so far employed. Aznar estimated the government forces at 47,000 men, and all observers reported the exceptional weight of the artillery, especially of anti-aircraft guns. By contrast, the nationalist forces that could immediately be committed were weak. 2 Banderas of the Falange, 3 Centurias, and the San Quintin Battalion, plus the subsector services concentrated on Brunit. Some reserves were thrown in early on to help the defense, but the whole force was clearly inadequate to prevent an attack in depth. The fighting conditions were therefore as good as they could be for the Republicans. Rojo estimated that, apart from the Battle of the Ebro, Brunit was the only operation perfectly prepared by the Republican side. The secret was perfectly kept, which was quite exceptional. Roughly speaking, the battle consisted of 2 phases. The Republican offensive took place between the 5th and the 13th of July. The nationalist counteroffensive lasted from the 15th to the end of the month. On July 5th, the general offensive was preceded by attacks in the direction of Aranjuez. During the night between the 5th and the 6th, the assault was successfully launched. The anticipated breakthrough was achieved. In the center, the Lister Division, making a deep thrust, occupied Brunit. The gains made were such that it was possible to anticipate a great victory. But by July 7th, the offensive was slowing down, and the fresh advances made were purely local and lacking in scope. It was clearly running out of steam. The occupation of Villafranca del Castillo, to the extreme east of the positions, lasted barely a day, the Moroccan Tabors managing to retake the village on the 12th. From then on, the Republicans confined themselves to limiting the nationalist counterattacks as far as possible. All in all, on the operational level, it amounted to failure. To explain this, both the lack of means and the government's blunders must be taken into account. The obvious mistake was not to have exploited the initial success by broadening the scope of the attack. While the Lister Division was holding the positions gained on the 6th and 7th, the Republican command spent itself on villages that a handful of nationalists defended with desperate energy. By wasting 4 days on these positions, the Republicans allowed the nationalist reinforcements to arrive. On the other hand, by persisting, they suffered very heavy casualties and also weakened their military potential. These 2 features kept recurring during the war. On the one hand, the command's timorous character and its lack of a broad overall conception, and on the other, the slowness of operations, which cannot be explained solely by the resistance encountered but must also take account of the violent and unexpected reactions of the troops involved. This, in particular, accounts for the failure of the subsidiary attack, which should have led to the forward troops were often seized with panic and obliged to the encirclement of the nationalists to the south of Madrid. Whole of the forces grouped in that sector to withdraw to their original positions. These sudden retreats, so frequent in the major Republican campaigns, often made a large-scale movement impossible, especially at Brunit. In fact, things nearly turned to disaster there, because the front suddenly found itself completely depleted at one point as the result of a fresh panic. In the end, however, the counterattack launched by General Varela was halted. Ultimately, Brunit was a half-success for the government forces. A small number of their initial objectives had been attained. The pocket created to the north of Brunit, which merely succeeded in lengthening the front, cannot be considered a significant advance. More important were the troop movements that Franco had been forced into. He had had to recall 2 Navarrese brigades and most of the air force from the northern front. It was, moreover, the air superiority of the nationalists that had been the deciding factor in the struggle. The almost incessant machine gunning by day and bombing raids by night broke the offensive and managed to foil the Republican move. Certainly respite had been won for organizing the defense of Santander. But this respite was short-lived. By the end of July, part of the troops engaged at Brunit were able to return to the north to take part in a new and decisive assault, which was working toward the collapse of the northern front and the fall of the Asturian industrial area. The campaign against Santander, in fact, there was only a fortnight's calm between the end of the Battle of Brunit and the beginning of the new offensive against Santander. This scarcely left time to put an attacking force in position. The two essential factors were, as at Bilbao, the Navarrese brigades and the whole complement of Italian troops, CTV and Black Arrows, now reorganized. All these forces were placed under General Davila. The battalion's allocation of artillery was strengthened, and the air force was again concentrated in the north. Franco hoped to be able to make a great effort in August and September, in such a way as to be done with Santander and Asturias by the end of the summer, before the rainy season slowed down operations in the mountainous area. On the Republican side, Ulibarri, appointed as commander of the troops on the northern front, theoretically had 4 army corps. But the Basque Army Corps was made up of troops sorely tested by the earlier fighting, who had fallen back on the province of Santander. They had even stopped fighting to defend their territory. They were morally and materially weakened. Yet they were entrusted with the whole of the eastern sector. The 2 Asturian Army Corps, the 16th and the 17th, were only partially committed in the Santander operations. In the end, the defense of Santander was far harder to organize than that of Bilbao. Though the province is protected to the south by a mountain barrier beyond the passes of Los Toros, Escudo, and Reynosa, no obstacle of any importance bars the way to the coast. Nor were there any fortifications similar to the Iron Ring. To fill this gap, men born between 1913 and 1920 were mobilized and enrolled in labor battalions, with the job of building a second line of entrenchments behind the one completed by the disciplinary companies and the frontline troops. However, the lack of organization and the scale of the work to be accomplished made this a hazardous task. The lack of improvement of arms supplies meant that it took time to get organized. Ulibarri tried to gain the necessary respite by launching an offensive from the pocket on the front to the south of Reynosa. But the attack, made by an Asturian army corps, was swiftly halted. A failure of this sort, coupled with the halting of the Brunete offensive, merely emphasized the feeling of isolation that pervaded the northern region. Santander had only 2 destroyers, the Ciscar and the José Luis Diaz, to protect its communications with the outside world by sea. Moreover, these warships were quite ineffectual. The blockade, already decided on and organized by the Nationalist command on the Biscay coast, worked even better during the Santander campaign. It was not surprising, in such circumstances, that there was a lightning campaign. Fighting was widespread only during the first 3 or 4 days, and the fate of the campaign was decided within a few hours. The 2 main positions on the Escudo and Reynosa passes were attacked, the first by the CTV, with the Littorio division in reserve, the second by 3 Navarrese brigades. In spite of the ease of defense in this mountainous sector, success was complete and rapid, and the use of motorized units further accentuated how crushing was the Nationalist advance. On August 14th, the first evening of the fighting, the order was given to the men furthest forward in the Reynosa pocket to withdraw, in order to avoid being encircled. Within 48 hours, the Navarrese had taken Reynosa after destroying the only serious resistance they had met, and had occupied a naval artillery factory, where guns in process of manufacture were seized. Reynosa did not hold out. Only 1 Asturian battalion resisted for a few hours in the streets of the town. Meanwhile, the Italians, after a mass tank attack, occupied Escudo. The motorized column that was advancing to the south linked up with the Navarrese. Once again, material superiority had been decisive. There was now no serious obstacle before the Nationalists. There was a little sporadic resistance, such as that by the Asturians who left Corcante a mere heap of rubble. But many Basque battalions surrendered, and contrary to orders from Ulibarri, who had called for a withdrawal to Asturias, the Basque troops began to concentrate around Santona. By August 17th, the second phase of the operation was in motion. A rapid, mass advance, which led to the wiping out of the defenses of Santander province in about 10 days. On the 25th, the British warship Keith took on board there the 17 hostages that remained from Bilbao, with their guards and a certain number of Basque leaders, whom Aguirre, arriving from the central zone, joined in Bayonne. Juan Ruiz, the socialist governor, and General Ulibarri left in the evening aboard a submarine. Civil guards, asaltos, and carabineros revolted. Their leaders made contact with the Nationalists, informing them that they were ready to surrender the town, where only the men of the CNTFAI showed any inclination to resist. A communiqué from the Nationalist command on the 27th announced that the entry of the troops, planned for the 26th, had been delayed 24 hours, law and order in Santander henceforth being maintained by the population. The alliance of the army and police leaders with the nationalist sympathizers made surrender inevitable. As the Santander front crumbled, the Basques in Laredo capitulated. Capitulation by the Basques. The capitulation by the Basques in Laredo, following an agreement in due form, raised problems of every kind. The simplest was that of relations within the Republican coalition. The others involved both Franco's policy with regard to an eventual reconciliation and his relations with his Italian allies. Finally, and less obviously, British policy now began to make itself felt. Without retracing the history of the diplomatic contacts made with a view to a political settlement of the conflict, it must be noted that, since the beginning of the Civil War, several approaches had been made to the Basques. Their political and material isolation must in fact have prompted some of their leaders to examine the possibilities of an honorable settlement. According to Cantalupo, the first attempt at separate negotiation took place at his instigation immediately after Guadalajara. The Italian consul in San Sebastian, Cavalletti, made the first move and was informed by the Jesuit Father Peretta of the guarantees requested by Aguirre and Jauregui. Opportunity for the leaders to leave Spain, no reprisals against the civilian population except where common law offenses were involved, and lastly exclusively Italian mediation, which implied control of the surrender operations and of the conditions for repression by the Italian command, in order to avoid massacres similar to those that had occurred at Badajoz and Malaga. It was this last point that led to the failure of the move, because the nationalist command found it hard to accept Italian control, which could have spread to the whole of Spain. Besides, what would guarantees made by Franco have been worth? These negotiations seemed to drag on into May. Aguirre confirmed that he was sounded out in Bilbao by an emissary, but without any result. Faupel, the German ambassador, attributed the failure of the talks to opposition from Franco. But the fall of Bilbao, the heavy losses of the Basques, and constant pressure from the Vatican led to renewed contacts. Von Hassel, the German ambassador in Rome, telegraphed on July 7, just as the offensive against Santander was under preparation, that delegates from the Basques are negotiating surrender, and that the Italian government is using its influence over Franco to obtain lenient conditions. The Basques, who had fought bravely to defend their country, now felt as if they were fighting for people who were strangers to them, and for an ideology that was not theirs. After the loss of Biscay, they had stopped taking a serious part in the fighting. Their withdrawal to Santona was a prelude to their capitulation. The president of the Basque Nationalist Party, Juan de Churiagara, negotiated with General Mancini and signed the Pact of Laredo. The Basques handed over their arms to the Italians, released political prisoners, and promised to maintain law and order in the zone they controlled until they were relieved by the Italians. In return, the latter guaranteed the lives of combatants and authorized the Basque leaders who were in the territory to leave. But these guarantees were made only to Basques. The non-Basque combatants in the Santona area were thus caught in a real trap under the surveillance of the Basques, who were maintaining law and order. The capitulation took effect on August 25. The Italians occupied Laredo on the 25th and Santona on the 26th. The embarkation of the leaders began on the 27th on two British vessels, the Bobby and the Seven Seas Spray, under the direct supervision of the Italians. The Spanish official arrived with orders from Franco banning all departures. The Basque leaders, the members of the defense junta who had organized the capitulation in good order, were arrested. The pact was torn up. Franco ignored the word of the Italian officers. It was the Basques who were now caught in a trap. Only a semblance of an army now remained in Santander province, which the Asturian militias hastily evacuated. In 5 days, the nationalist troops had advanced 25 miles beyond Santander. The end of Asturias, however, a front was formed again in the coastal area, stretching from Santander to Gijón. Moreover, the mountainous area formed a solid rampart that the Asturias militiamen exploited admirably. Moreover, it was not long before the advance of the Navarrese slowed down. It took them over a month of fighting to cover the 25 miles between Riedcella and Villaviciosa. At this point, on October 19, Gijón was directly threatened. Could resistance continue? And, more important, could it last until winter, as the Madrid government was asking? The New York Times correspondent wrote, The retreating Asturians seem determined to leave behind them only smoking ruins and desolation when they are finally obliged to abandon a town or village. The rebels generally find them dynamited and burnt to the ground. On October 19, Franco did not hesitate, in the face of such stubborn resistance, to wire Mussolini to dispatch a new division in order to liquidate the front before winter. However, resistance collapsed within 48 hours. On October 20th at 2 a.m., Colonel Pradas reported to a meeting of the Council of Asturias on the military situation, which he considered gravely imperiled and almost desperate. The material and munitions requested from Madrid had not arrived, and the morale of the troops was low, worsened by pessimism in the rear. In his view, all resistance was impossible. They could hold on, if they wanted, until they were crushed, in which case the members of the council might as well leave for the front. However, he thought that it was possible to save part of the army by ordering a withdrawal to the ports of Gijón, Avilés, and Candes, on condition that it was carried out that day. Tomorrow it will be too late. The council was divided. Negrin's orders were categorical. They must hold out to the end. But only the communists Ambu and Rosas pleaded for obedience. The majority came out in favor of withdrawal. The council proclaimed its sovereignty, which relieved it of any tie of obedience to Madrid, and ordered a departure by sea using every possible means. Colonel Pradas felt that he could complete this operation within 24 hours. Only part of it was achieved. 5 planes landed at Bayonne during the day of the 20th. In them were officers, who said they had received orders to evacuate the staff. Russian officers also arrived at Bayonne in an Air Pyrenees plane. At 5 a.m., the communist leaders left in a motorboat. At 8, Bellarmino Tomas went aboard a fishing boat, El Abascal, with the other members of the council, including Segundo Blanco, who had returned from the central zone the previous day by plane. During the night, a revolt broke out, of which Colonel Pradas had no doubt got wind. Colonel Franco, commander of the garrison, backed by the Civil Guard and the Carabineros, took control of the town and immediately made contact with the Navarrese, whom he begged to speed up their march on the city, where he feared an anarchist uprising. On the 21st, at 10 a.m., the radio announced, "We are waiting impatiently. Long live Franco." Thousands of militiamen, deserted by their leaders and disarmed by the civil guards, were already prisoner when the Navarrese arrived. After the fall of Gijón, the northern front ceased to exist. However, all resistance had not ended. Mopping up operations there went on much longer than in Biscay and in Santander province, and consequently Franco was unable to immediately transfer all of the troops engaged there to the central front. The conquest of the north had ultimately been only one phase of the war. Belchite, however, to the rebels, this was their greatest victory since the battle at Madrid had altered in character. It was doubly important. Economically, it gave Franco some of the most important Spanish provinces, the only ones at any rate where the Republicans could have established a war industry. It provided the essential commercial product of iron ore. Militarily, it not only revealed the superiority of the nationalist army over the divided and badly armed Basque and Asturian troops, it also proved that, at that stage at least, the army of Valencia and Madrid was incapable of effectively halting a nationalist offensive. Brunit had been only a half-success. The second major attempt at Belchite was a total failure. The choice of Belchite was justified by considerations diametrically opposed to those at Brunit. The front had not undergone any reorganization there. The soldiers, said Rojo, are hunters rather than soldiers, which meant that they operated in small groups, isolated or linked with the rest of the front by observation posts. But the enemy soldiers were no better off. It therefore seemed easy to breach the front. On the other hand, the maneuver could be extended with relatively limited numbers. The objectives were as follows: to take Saragossa by a 3-pronged attack on Zuera, to the north of the Ebro, and on Saragossa itself, and to the south to reduce the pocket formed by the front between Quinto and Belchite. At the same time, the Republican command obviously hoped to force the nationalists to defer their offensive in the north. But the offensive began very late on August 29th, several days after the capture of Santander. Most of the troops involved had had to be transported to the sector of attack, along bad roads and amidst immense confusion. Finally, The unmaneuverability of the Republican troops was once again amply demonstrated. There was only one success, the capture of Quinto and Belchite. It took another 12 days for Belchite to fall. The lofty ambitions of the offensive against Saragossa were abandoned after a fruitless attempt north of the Ebro. Belchite was a failure because none of the vital objectives had been attained. The conquest of the north by the nationalists had not been delayed by a single day. Henceforth, the map showed two Spains in conflict. The nationalists dominated the whole of the west and northwest part of the country. Their territory formed a single block from Galicia to Aragon, from Gibraltar to the Gulf of Gascony. Chapter 17. Political Evolution in Nationalist Spain. The conquest of the north did not only give the nationalists economic and strategic advantages. It provided an assurance for foreign states that the movimiento could not be defeated by force of arms. It affirmed Franco's military superiority at a time when he was becoming, in the view of everyone in rebel Spain, the uncontested leader of the crusade. The army's dominance had at once imposed law and order through fear. Nevertheless, the political situation in nationalist Spain had remained extraordinarily confused during the early months. During this period, in fact, and until October 1936, the leaders of the rebellion had not considered a political organization necessary in that zone. They devoted all their efforts to the pursuit of a war that they thought would be short-lived. They were content to secure their rear by means of forceful measures. Thus they could not and did not allow any opposition party to linger on. The proclamation of a state of siege put the means of breaking all resistance in the hands of the military authorities. There were no longer any trade unions nor workers or Republican parties, and the other parties no longer showed signs of any serious activity. Moreover, a decision on September 25, 1936 banned all political and trade union activity. Though a worker and peasant resistance existed in Andalusia and particularly in Extremadura, it had been decapitated after the initial nationalist victories and the violent repression that had followed them. It was barely visible except through acts of sabotage in factories and guerrillas who harried the nationalists, without constituting a very serious threat to their safety. But the military dictatorship was unable to conceal the disparity between the forces that had taken part in the movimiento and the lack of qualified political personnel. Outside the regular forces, there was, as in Republican Spain in the early days of the uprising, a diversity of uniforms symbolizing political differences. A report in Le Temps on October 8, overtly favorable to the rebels, emphasized the cheerful disorder that prevailed in the Pamplona and Vitoria area. The clothes worn by the Fleches, young boys in the Falangist youth, and the Palayos, the young Carlists, injected a strange note, the black trousers, blue shirts, and police caps of the former contrasting with the khaki uniforms and red berets of the latter. One or another faction prevailed in a particular sector. In this way, the Albifianists were mainly recruited from the Burgos region. There were large numbers of Falangists in Salamanca, the Blue Town, and in Valladolid. The Requetes, who were the most picturesque, were manifestly dominant in Navarre, where the red boina, the Carlist beret, acted as a rallying sign. Thus, declarations of apoliticality in the early days were merely on principle. They emphasized the transitory character of the period, leaving uncertainty about the future. Was military dictatorship an expedient, or would it continue? Which of the predominant political forces, whose aims were not always similar, the traditionalist monarchists or the Falangists, were to prevail? At the outset, the question had been deliberately avoided. In the early days of the uprising, the flags of the Republic could be seen floating alongside monarchist flags. Finally, the royal colors had been readopted, though it did not imply that the monarchy would be the permanent regime in Spain. The men of the new regime, since the insurgent country needed a central body all the same, a provisional junta had been established. Its official head was the aging General Cabanellas, of the noble beard and limited ability, no doubt with the intention of avoiding a difficult choice between the leaders of the uprising after Sanjurjo's death. But real power was quickly seized by the Cuerpo de Llano Molafranco triumvirate. When it became necessary to establish, along with unity of military command, absolute political authority, it was entrusted to General Franco. Most of the men who could have vied with him were dead. Sanjurjo, who was the real leader of the uprising, had disappeared at its outset. Of the other military leaders, only Cuerpo and Mola had authority comparable to Franco's. However, Quaipo, the dictator of the South, did not have the breadth of a political leader. He lacked both subtlety and caution in his opinions. Before the Civil War, he had compromised himself by his attitude as a Republican and Masonic leader, and the Republican government had even contemplated entrusting him with the repression of the insurgent movement. Later on, nicknamed the Social General because he had had workers' cities built during the war, he acquired rather spurious popularity by his blusterings on the radio and his excesses of language. But his unexpected success in the early weeks of the uprising and the decisive role that Seville played in later operations had made him one of the Movimiento's leaders. Later on, his political role continued to wane, and after the capture of Malaga, an Italian success rather than a Spanish one, he never again had the opportunity of launching an important military operation. Emilio Mola, because of his past and his qualities, enjoyed far greater prestige. Until his death in a plane accident during the campaign in the north, he was the only military leader with great authority who had his own ideas about the conduct of the war and policy, making him a frequent opponent of Franco. According to the latter, he was too stubborn to bend to another's will. His influence in the northern zone, fief of the Requetes, made him a rallying point for monarchist intrigue. Moreover, after his death, in order to demonstrate that no one could take the place of the missing leader, Franco made a point of exercising direct control over operations on the northern front, and Davila, who had effective command, always remained a subordinate. The political leaders of the uprising had also disappeared or had proved incapable of imposing their views. Calvo Sotelo, the monarchist, had died in circumstances that are already known. Of the other monarchist leaders, Gil Robles seemed timorous and ineffectual faced with the violence of events, in which moreover he had not taken an active part. Manuel Falconde, the head of the traditionalist commune, was too politically inflexible to hope to establish unity around his party. The early leaders of the Falange had also disappeared. José Antonio Primo de Rivera, who had been shot in Alicante, was still the absent one, the ausent to his supporters, which was a way of regarding him as irreplaceable. Ruiz de Aida, the pilot, was dead too. Onésimo Redondo had been killed in the early fighting. Fernández Cuesta was in a Republican prison. The only ones who were still there to run the Falange were second-raters, like Manuel Hidilla, chairman of the Provisional Junta, and its secretary Francisco Bravo. Both were camisas viejas, former militants, by contrast with the thousands of men who had turned Falangist between February and July 1936, in order to find a framework for action against the left or shortly after the uprising, in order to obtain the precious safe conduct of a party card. Although they did not have leaders capable of asserting themselves, the Falangists, like the Requetes, and often in spite of them, were one of the dynamic forces in the Movimiento. Unity between the two groups was clearly difficult to achieve and demanded, if they were to survive a long war victoriously, the existence of a political arbiter. In the same way, rivalry between the military leaders had to give way to unified military command. This arbiter, who quickly asserted himself as an authoritarian and obeyed leader, was General Franco. This took place gradually between July 1936 and June 1937. On October 1, 1936, after the link-up between the forces in the north and the south, Franco became Generalissimo and head of state. These powers had been entrusted to him by the other military leaders, after a meeting held in Salamanca on September 29, 1936. No doubt this was merely a restricted and provisional authority, which was extended to the beginning of 1937 after the failure at Madrid. But the authority that was conferred on him in October 1936 was political as much as military. "I entrust you," said Cabanellas at the official ceremony for the transfer of functions, "with the absolute powers of the state." The nationalist provisional government, the system that was then functioning in nationalist Spain, remained a provisional one. It answered the needs of the moment. It was useful because it set aside problems that could have been the cause of divisions, and because it enabled the energies of the leaders and troops to be devoted wholeheartedly to the primary task of handling the war. It was necessary because there were too few officials and technicians to ensure the smooth working of the government apparatus. Some of them had remained loyal to the Republican government, many had been dismissed, sentenced, or were merely under suspicion. Only the diplomatic corps was mainly favorable to the uprising. A considerable number of military men held posts as officials. This political system should normally have ended with the entry of nationalist troops into Madrid. The provisional capital was Burgos, But Franco was more often in residence at Salamanca, where the general staff had its quarters. Also in Salamanca was the Generalissimo's eldest brother and the strong man of the new regime, Nicolas Franco, with the title of Secretary General to the head of state. He was in charge of the war economy, public order, and also foreign relations. He was therefore a very powerful individual. At that period, the Generalissimo could in fact only supervise political questions, since he was absorbed with the running of military operations. At least he was assured of sharing power only with reliable men. The third man in the provisional government was General Sanguinais, the Generalissimo's principal private secretary. Sanguinais had been Franco's disciple from the very start. He had been in his liaison between the Canaries and Spain. These two organs, the Secretariat General and the Generalissimo's Secretariat, were completed by new departments created before the end of 1936. These were rough sketches for future ministries in the nationalist government. The Secretariat for Foreign Affairs, initially under the former Spanish minister in Vienna, Francisco Surratt, the Secretariat of War, entrusted to General Gil Yuste, and the task of Governor-General, given to another soldier, General Francisco Formoso, whose functions were however as broad as they were vague. Administrative control of the provinces, appointments, and relations with provincial deputations. The offices of public security were installed in Valladolid. A press and propaganda office was opened in Salamanca. It was directed by Milan Estrée, the founder of the Tercio, and remained closely linked with the departments of the Secretariat General. It was however intended as much to orient the nationalist press as to inform foreign correspondents visiting nationalist Spain. Finally, alongside the essential organs of the new Franco regime, were installed the departments of the technical junta, whose role was to prepare the decrees submitted to the head of the government for his signature. Finance, justice, industry, trade and food supplies, agriculture, labor, education, public works, and communications. Within the framework of the technical junta were the bureaus and offices that, in the style of a totalitarian system, were to control the whole of the country's activities and operate the war economy. This was a difficult task, the running of which fell to General Davila. The latter was, like Sanguinais, one of the officers who enjoyed the Generalissimo's complete confidence. Although he was playing a second-rate role, it was a substantial one. At the same time as he was superintending the work of the junta, he was Army Chief of Staff. Consequently, Franco exercised power directly or through his friends. But it seems that in October-November he had not yet made a choice about the future. The provisional government's program, which should have reflected its political tendencies, did not produce any original ideas. It was a compromise between Falconde's ideas and the theories of the Phalangists. Traditionalist survivals included the establishment of a government of totalitarian character, the chance of a monarchist restoration, and above all the idea of national unity, which was one of the recurring themes of nationalist propaganda and of Franco's speeches. The Spanish Civil War, he declared, is a fight of unity against secession. Certain principles emerged from the Phalange program, such as compulsory work. The new state cannot allow parasitical citizens, but guaranteed and protected against the abuses of capitalism, fair wages for labor, and finally the possibility of profit sharing. In thus borrowing from everyone, Franco gave the impression of merely having sought at the time to play the role of indispensable arbiter. The rapid victory expected by the nationalists would undoubtedly have raised the problem of what direction to give the regime. The failure at Madrid completely altered the question. It was necessary to maintain a strong authority in the face of an uncertain military situation, to avoid internal quarrels and, consequently, to put off the choice for or against the monarchy. The provisional status quo was no longer adequate. It was necessary, in Suner's words, to give the movement the character and appearance of a state. Franco was no longer merely the Generalissimo. He became the inspired leader of the movimiento, the Caudillo. General Franco, thus an initial political evolution was achieved. The man who had merely been one of the principal leaders of the movimiento had become supreme military leader. It was not long before General Franco transformed himself into a master and a savoir. Yet this small, stocky man, plump, spruce, and overbearing, with a round face and a black mustache, was not very impressive physically. On photographs, his dumpiness and his premature paunch contrasted with Mola and kind Elon. But this lack of bearing had not prevented him from enjoying an extremely brilliant political career. a captain at 21 and a general at 32. This was exceptional even in the Spanish army. Born on December 3, 1892, Francisco Franco y Bahamonde was the second child of Nicolas Franco, a naval paymaster from EI Faro. His studies at the Sacre Coeur in EI Faro, then at the Naval College, earmarked him, like his father and his maternal grandfather, for a naval career. But fate intervened because there was no room at the Naval Cadet School, and Francisco became an officer cadet at the Infantry Academy in Toledo. He left it a second lieutenant in 1910, but his real career began after 2 years on garrison duty, when he was sent to Morocco to take part in the battle around the old Presidios, Melilla, Ceuta, and Larache. In the harsh and inglorious initial fighting, casualties were heavy, and he was one of the few who remained unscarred by 4 years of war. He was wounded in 1916. By that time he was already a major. After a long interval, he returned to Morocco and was attached to the Spanish Foreign Legion, which was then being organized by Milan Astray. His reputation as a military leader and an organizer began as a result of his part in the Tercios battles from 1920 to 1924. His biographers have credited him with the leading role in the landing at Alhucemas Bay, which, coming after a series of reverses, put new heart into the army of Marica. He was showered with honors and became the youngest general in the army, and Milan Astray's successor at the head of the legion. Finally, on his return to Spain, he was given the directorship of the General Military Academy, which had just been founded in Saragossa. He was therefore one of the most highly regarded military leaders when the 1931 revolution broke out. The rest of his story is bound up with the republics. Sometimes he was out of favor, sometimes at the top of the honors list. It is certain that he hesitated for a long while before joining the plot against the Republican government. He approached Pozas and then Azafia between February and July 1936 to ask them to crush the revolution. This may be regarded as a manifestation of his hostility to the revolutionary left, but it was also evidence that he wished to give the Republic a chance even if he later fought it bitterly until it was utterly defeated. Although Franco was slow and cautious in his decisions, he stuck to them afterward with a determination and even a stubbornness that was one of the outstanding features of his character. He undoubtedly had exceptional qualities, real intelligence and great shrewdness, which made him as good a politician as a soldier, if not better. He was adept at concealing his views. He was calm, tactful, and sparing of words, which does not altogether square with his Spanish temperament, though it must be remembered that he was a Galician. He knew exactly how to make use of the opportunities given him. Many lucky chances came General Franco's way. His entry into the army, the war in the Rif, and the disappearance of the original leaders of the uprising were all factors that explain the great self-confidence with which observers credited him. But Francisco Franco was also a deeply Catholic officer. His education, the influence exerted on him by a monarchist environment, and his respect for established religion certainly alienated him from so-called fascism. Franco was a conservative in the military and Catholic tradition. The position he had come to occupy instilled in him the idea that he had been appointed by God to save Spain from anarchy, atheism, and revolution in all its manifestations. Long regarded as a royalist, although he had agreed to be a senior official in the Republican regime, brought up in a charismatic tradition, he regarded himself as chosen, even sacred. As a realist, however, he did not believe in the possibility of immediately re-establishing the monarchy in its traditional form, which would have split the supporters of the movimiento. He was also a realist in refusing, as he did, any compromise with the Reds, because the rift between the two parties could not have been bridged by negotiation. In short, the war provided him with the opportunity to develop his political qualities. A calm man and a player for time, he was not given to outbursts or strokes of genius, but after the humiliation of Madrid, he managed to adapt himself to a long war. In the conduct and winning of this war, he held many trumps. First was the territory he controlled. The nationalist government was much more favored than the Republican government. The resources in these areas complemented each other: the flocks of Estremadura and the farmlands of the big Andalusian estates, the corn of Castile and the vegetables of Galicia. In contrast, the large, densely populated cities which had to be fed were on the Republican side. Financially, in the absence of the Bank of Spain's resources, Franco had access to his supporters' wealth, capital smuggled out of Republican Spain and substantial foreign backing, whose interests Juan March represented. On the other hand, the exploitation of the Moroccan and Rio Tinto mines, seized by the rebels at the start of the Movimiento, and, after August 1937, effective control of the Basque provinces and the Santander area guaranteed an exchange currency indispensable to a stable economy. Also, nationalist Spain did not undergo any serious economic crisis. But General Franco had to resolve the profound contradictions between the political forces that he was relying on. So that his absolute authority should not remain nominal, he had to reconcile the conservative tendencies of the traditionalists with the phalangist ideas that sought a complete transformation of the state. The single party. To achieve this goal, he used a radical method, the formation of a single party, of which he was to be indisputable leader, in imitation of what had happened in Germany and Italy. The task was a difficult one. The monarchists had a strong political organization. Their differences had been erased in action, and the dominant part played in the uprising by the traditionalist commune enabled it to absorb a large number of Acción popular forces. Heavily represented in Castile, it was mainly dominant in Navarre and Aragon, bastions of the uprising. Its leaders enjoyed considerable help and friendship from abroad. Faced with the protraction of the conflict, they declared their feelings openly. They demonstrated at San Sebastian in February, and Falconde came out publicly for an immediate restoration of the monarchy. Franco regarded this as a fairly serious threat. He wondered if it were not advisable to have Falconde shot for the crime of high treason. At any rate, the Carlist leader was obliged to make for Portugal. The Phalange, too, had become a prominent political force. It had rallied a great number of persons who were attracted by its dynamism or who saw it as a progressive force, as opposed to the conservatism of the Requetes. The Phalangists, often of Republican and trade union origin, demanded that the social problem should be raised and solved. They had considerable military forces, organized into militias in Castile, Extremadura, and Andalusia. Lacking direct support, they enjoyed the sympathy of the Burgos government's Italian and German allies. But the Phalange remained a party without a worthy leader. Moreover, the political parties in view were not alone in playing a role. Franco managed to use the army by placing it in the front rank. The military leaders were undoubtedly not always in agreement with him, and opponents emerged who were overtly hoping for a government led by Mola. Most of the officers clearly did not have very dogmatic political viewpoints and were merely exhibiting their wish to support an authoritarian government. But the army existed as a political force and was in no mood to have its political powers reduced. It was a power on which the Generalissimo could rely. The single-party principle and the reforms that derived from it had long been accepted by Franco. Their application had at first been delayed by the Caudillo's wishes in order to obtain universal consent through negotiation. It was a question of not giving offens. The drawing up of a plan for a decree was announced in early February 1937. The easiest part had been to obtain the dissolution of the old right-wing parties, which had lost a great deal of their influence. Gil Robles's Acción Popular had disappeared by February 10. A few days afterward, Robles, who had not made a move since the start of the uprising, confirmed that he was giving up all political activity. At the same time, Goicoechea announced that the other monarchist party, Renovación Española, had also disappeared. Such encouraging statements were not, however, enough to establish the desired unity. No entente between the Phalange and the traditionalists could be obtained by negotiation. Reforms, therefore, had to be imposed. There remained the question of finding an excuse. The one that was invoked was an incident between rival Phalangist groups in Salamanca. As the decree stated, minor dissensions within organizations, reviving old political intrigues, threatened to disrupt organizations and authority. The April 19 unification decree was presented as an act of peace. Franco had given careful attention to the text of this edict. According to Serrano Sufier, who claimed to have drawn up the final text, Franco took special pains to work on and annotate the Phalange statutes and sought to harmonize the language of the traditionalist Pradera with that of José Antonio. He finally submitted the decree to the approval of Queipo and Mola. Both accepted the text unreservedly. Mila's only objection was a grammatical one. However, Quipo asked for its publication to be put off for a month, on the pretext of waiting for the fall of Madrid. "There is an urgent need," said the preamble to the unification decree, "to accomplish the great task of peace, crystallizing in the new state the ideas and the style of our revolution." This phrase alone established the importance of the text. In it, first of all, could be seen the formation of a single party. It is indispensable that everyone should expunge personal differences from his heart. It was equally easy to find in it previously stated principles, a legacy of the Requetes and the Phalange. But the decree also stressed the reasons that had made its promulgation necessary. The political parties are wearing themselves out in sterile conflict. By acting in this way, the leaders were betraying the masses of their supporters who are moved by a pure ideal. It was therefore as well to safeguard this ideal, accepted by everyone and proclaimed by the state. The new party was to be a link between state and society, guarantee of the people's vigorous adherence to the state, a link between traditional forces and new ones. The Phalange is bringing, with its program for the youthful masses, a new style of propaganda, a political and heroic form for the present. The Requetes have brought the sacred trust of Spanish tradition, tenaciously preserved, with its Catholic spirituality. A profound idea emerged here, the determination to create not only a genuine party, that is, a political organization that could be used by the government, but a hermandad, a fraternal society, of the sort that Spanish tradition could inspire, along the lines of the half-secular, half-religious organizations formed by the Catholic kings. To link the present with the past, reviving Spain's glory in a new form, such was the task of the crusade, at least for the immediate future. This was because the Caudillo refused to be a prisoner of his own decisions and was already starting to consider the possibility of modifying the edict. This will not be a rigid thing, but one subject to a task of revision and improvement. The actual decree contained 3 articles. Article 1. The Spanish Phalange and the Requetes, with their services and their present members, are being merged, under my command, into a single political authority of national character, which will be known as the Phalange Española Tradicionalista y de los Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista. The principal mission of this organization, halfway between society and the state, is to communicate the feelings of the people to the state and to convey to them the thinking of the state through the politico-moral virtues of service, hierarchy, and brotherhood. All those who, on the publication day of the decree, hold a Phalange or traditional community card, are officially affiliated with the new organization, and all Spaniards who wish to join may do so. In appearance, this article gave satisfaction to the Phalange by introducing the idea of a political morality, and especially by retaining the essential part of the Phalange's name to denote the new party. Franco had, moreover, intimated before April 19 that the Phalange would be the basis of the single party. But the 2 ensuing articles revealed the true meaning of the decree, which was intended to muzzle all opposition and to destroy all possibilities of a military action or a simple coup de force by malcontents. Article 2. Governing agents of the new Politico-National Ensemble will be the head of state, a secretariat or political junta, and the National Council. The secretariat or junta corresponds to the establishment of the internal constitution of the ensemble, for the accomplishment of its principal aim, to help its leader in the preparation of the state's organic and functional structure, and to collaborate, in any case, with the government's activities. Half of its members will be appointed by the head of state and the other half elected by the National Council. The National Council will handle major national problems that the head of state submits to it in terms that will be established in accordance with subsequent arrangements. Article IL. The militias of the Phalange and the Requetes will be merged into a single national militia, preserving their emblems and their insignia. The national militia is subordinate to the army. The head of state is the supreme head of the militia, and the direct head will be an army general. Although General Franco thus allowed signs and symbols to survive, he took care to empty them of their real meaning. A peacemaker and diplomat, he was always amenable to superficial concessions. Thus, in order to conciliate the Requetes, he had the ancient emblem of Navarre added to the new arms of Spain. He also had the entrance to his headquarters guarded by Requetes. In fact, the last 2 articles of the April 19 decree were a decisive step on the path to the establishment of a new regime. The second ratified the political authority of the Caudillo, who was building and consequently could always modify the structure of the state. He appointed the majority of the leaders of the single party. All the members of the First National Council were directly nominated by him. Article 3 contrived to give him total military authority by making him sole head of the national militia, which had been deliberately merged with the regular army and was subordinate to it. The new party thus constituted was therefore to be the instrument of government and to be used by Francisco Franco, head of state, head of the government, national head of the Movimiento and Generalissimo. His authority had been most vigorously asserted in every field. But it was advisable to ensure this authority and the organization of the new state in actual practice. For this newly established political system to function normally, it was necessary not only to launch the idea of national unity, but also to achieve this unity and to crush all opposition. All these steps were taken with an apparent view to conciliation. The formation of the Phalange's National Council was evidence of such astute distributive justice, which aimed at preserving, around the Caudillo's own person, genuine unity among the political elements that had taken part in the Movimiento. The council was made up of a shrewd admixture of former Phalangists such as Fernández Cuesta and Agustín Aznar, of monarchists such as Esteban Bilbao and Falcón, who in this way was making his political comeback, and also of soldiers such as Francisco Gómez Jordana and proven men, including Serrano Suñer. The danger clearly lay in displeasing all those in both parties who rightly feared that it would be impossible to find a common ground. Though Catholic support and the Caudillo's astuteness had reduced monarchist reactions to the minimum, it had not been so on the Phalangist side. The chances of persons overtly hostile to the Phalange's revolutionary program or of General Franco's friends entering the party junta worried the Camisas Viejas. The supreme power granted to Franco, whose past, education, and friendships were highly suspect, seemed even more dangerous to some of them. In such circumstances, to wait for the end of the war to bring about the triumph of the Phalange ideal was very risky. The discontent of these Phalangists soon came out in the open. This was the Hedilla plot. Political resistance. Manuel Hedilla took over the leadership of the Phalange, with the title of Secretary General. He had been one of José Antonio's close collaborators. His past as a manual worker, he had been a dock worker, was the guarantee of his social attitude. But he had no political training. Hughes described him as crude, violent, and immoderate. The plot that he organized seems, as far as one can tell, simplistic and even naive. To prepare demonstrations throughout the country to reveal the Phalange's discontent, to surround Franco's headquarters and take it by storm, and finally to proclaim a revolutionary political junta made up of Hedilla and his friends. This junta would, according to Suñer, have consisted of Pilar Primo de Rivera, sister of the former head of the Phalange, General Yegue, whose sympathies for the Phalange had long been known, Dionisio Rodrigo, and José Sáenz, among others. We are, however, reduced to supposition as to the details of this affair. The transcripts of the trial have never been made public. All we know are the charges against the Phalangists arrested. The most serious was unquestionably the attempt at military revolt. Possibly the importance of these activities has been deliberately exaggerated on the Franco side. Suñer accused Major Doval, in charge of public order at the Salamanca headquarters, of being a sensation seeker. It seems at any rate that the plot was very clumsily executed. Hedilla committed folly upon folly. Emissaries sent to the provinces, telegrams in code to the provincial delegations inciting them to resist the unification decree, orders passed on by the provincial leader in Zamora to the local leaders. All fully justified his arrest and trial. It is clear that there were a considerable number of arrests and that measures such as the provisional one banning Phalangists from entering Salamanca tended to demonstrate publicly that the new regime would not shrink from any decision, however serious, in order to impose its will. But what was really behind the plot? It is difficult to believe that Franco's government had been seriously threatened by this narrow-minded illiterate, of whom Franco complacently remarked to Faupel that he fell short of the abilities required of a head of the Phalange. In the same conversation, the Caudillo had alluded to a clutch of ambitious young men, who were exerting their influence on him, without however going into any further details. It is certain that Hedilla was prompted by others and that he was merely a front for them. In this respect, it is curious to note that permanent hostility to the regime in Pilar Primo de Rivera's circle continued. This woman, who was anxious to embody the spirit of the Phalange after her brother's death, seems to have been at the heart of the opposition of the Camisas Viejas to the Franco government. but her name protected her from police measures. By deliberately exaggerating and harshly repressing a clumsy plot, Franco clearly intended to impress more dangerous opponents than Hiddila. The young men, to whom the Generalissimo referred, had been encouraged from outside. The sympathy that the Phalange had always met in Rome and Berlin had increased since the arrival of ambassadors from the Axis powers. Though the first Italian ambassador, Cantalupo, whose mission was incidentally extremely brief, did not look very closely at the domestic politics of nationalist Spain, this was not true of his successor, Count Viola, and the German representative. Wilhelm von Faupel made no secret of his friendship for the Camisas Viejas. He was certainly in the know about the plot and may have supplied arms to the conspirators. Was Franco joking when he suggested to Faupel that he should send Hiddila to Germany and Italy for a few months, so that he can learn something and afterwards make use of his experiences in working for the country's recovery? In fact, Hiddila was soon to learn the outcome of his trial. The guilt of the accused was unanimously recognized. 4 death sentences were pronounced, including one on the former leader of the Phalange. According to Souffir, who does not usually sin through overgenerosity, the sentences were very harsh. Faupel, no doubt afraid of being regarded as responsible for the situation, tried to save Hiddila's life. He asked his government for instructions on what attitude to adopt toward the affair, while at the same time suggesting direct intervention and an appeal for clemency. He even suggested that a memorandum should be sent to the Generalissimo according to which the execution of Hiddila and his companions, at the present moment, is a step that seems open to criticism for political and social reasons. We do not know what reply Wilhelmstrasse made to its ambassador on this subject, nor if there was, as seems probable, an Italian move on behalf of Hiddila, but the death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. A pardon of this kind would not have weakened General Franco's position, quite the contrary. Besides, the need to safeguard national unity during the fighting ensured him a good deal of support. He claimed to have received, on May 5, 60,000 telegrams of congratulation and approval. In spite of this official optimism, it is certain that the spirit of opposition had survived in a number of Phalangist circles. It surged up from time to time and showed itself all the more violently because any form of hostility to the regime was stifled by continual repression. The most typical incident in this respect was the speech made on April 19, 1938, in Burgos by General Yagali. Yagali was one of the most popular nationalist military leaders. His substantial contribution to the war since the uprising in Morocco, his reputation as a social leader, and his personal friendships with the Camisas Viejas had made him the Phalange General, which explains why his name came up in Hiddila's plot. The criticisms that he made in his speech at Burgos seemed an echo of Phalangist disillusion as a result of the measures for social conservation taken by the nationalist government. It is necessary, said Yagi, to make a few social reforms. Justice must be made truly just and its partiality eliminated. The implications of these reproaches were in fact limited, and the incident did not have any serious repercussions. Naturally, sanctions were taken against Yagui, but although he was relieved of his command, it was not long before he returned to favor and received another appointment. The plot organized by Valles and Aznar was far more serious. Although the sentences passed on them were relatively light, this was because the regime was now secure, and it was not necessary to strike so hard as at the time of the Hiddila plot. On the contrary, it would have been dangerous to drive part of the Phalange Old Guard into the opposition ranks, and Franco was too diplomatic to do so. The important role in the Phalange played by the 2 men implicated in the new plot in fact made them well-known figures in the movimiento. Valles was certainly the more involved. A former member of the Moroccan branch of the Phalange and a national counselor like Aznar, he really seems to have sought the sympathies of several military leaders for a coup de force. Augustin Aznar, more cautious, merely attacked the leadership of the new regime with words. A former companion of José Antonio and friend of Fernández Cuesta, who did not follow him along this path, Aznar meant to stand for pure Phalangism, doctrinal intransigence. Head of the Phalangist militia before the war, which had induced him to take responsibility for the armed attacks in Madrid between February and July 1936, he was afterwards appointed Inspector General of the militias. In fact, to the Phalangists, the real enemy was not Franco but the conservative forces, the church and the monarchists. Opposition sometimes turned into brawls. Storer reported 19 skirmishes in Seville in early November 1938 between the Phalange and the clergy. Moreover, the Phalangists identified the church with monarchist reaction. Also, they were equally hostile to any attempt at a restoration. A number of monarchists felt after the war that Franco had bluffed them, and Saldo testified to the constant hope of a restoration. In fact, the Generalissimo had never given a commitment to the Requetes, and Mola himself had refused to decide in advance on the regime that the Movimiento would impose on Spain. Many royalists served the new state loyally and even did it considerable service. Thus Antonio Goicoechea became a respected figure in the nationalist system, and the Duke of Alba was an effective ambassador in London. Though restrained by discipline, Generals Ponte and Caindilon did not hide the fact that they were favorable to a restoration. Not a month passed without an eventual return to monarchy being envisaged. There was even speculation about making it easier by replacing Alfonso XIII with his son Don Juan. Franco never came out directly against such schemes. He merely kept his distance from them, pointing out that Spain must not be divided any further and that he must first safeguard the unity of the Movimiento, guarantee of national unity. The organization of the single party gave him the means of control and influence over all activity in Spain. This was the decisive step toward the realization of the new Spanish state, dictatorial in structure. But it was not until the early days of 1938 that a government was formed. Meantime, two important events occurred, which also contributed to strengthening the Caudillo's position. The first was the decisive victory won in the north, and the second was the official rallying of the clergy and the unreserved support that it brought to the new regime. The church's involvement. There is no doubt that, since the beginning of the war, the majority of the priests had taken sides, often in an active and even violent manner, in favor of the rebellion. But the Catholic hierarchy, while showing its sympathy, had refused to give official endorsement to a movement of revolt. The uncertainty of the early days, the concern not to break the church's unity, and the fact that a large part of the clergy remained loyal to the government explain this waiting game. The way the situation developed during 1937 led to a radical change in this position. The reasons for it appear simple. The protraction of the war, whose outcome seemed further and further away, led to making official a choice that was already evident in practice. The successes of the nationalists had improved the diplomatic position of the Burgos government, and the logic of events pointed toward the establishment of relations with the Vatican. Finally, the Biscay campaign resolved the problem posed by the existence of a Catholic minority within the Republican camp. Moreover, on October 7, 1937, the papal nuncio, Antonucci, presented his credentials to General Franco. A few months earlier, a stand taken by the majority of Spanish prelates had anticipated this move. Constant references by nationalists to the Catholic tradition and the work of the Catholic kings, and the personal influence of certain bishops, in particular the Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo, Goma y Tomas, had largely contributed to sway the ecclesiastical hierarchy in this direction. On July 1937, the collective letter from the Spanish bishops was published. It removed all ambiguity on the subject. Signed by 43 bishops and 5 capitular vicars led by Cardinal Goma and Cardinal Illandain, Archbishop of Seville, this text owed its importance not only to the fact that it was an explanation of the attitude of the clergy and the Spanish Catholics, but in particular to the fact that it was one of the few that tried to justify the Movimiento in a rational and intelligent way. First of all, the bishop's letter claimed to justify the Church's position by justifying the war. Although in some foreign countries, and more especially in certain French Catholic circles, there had been indignation at the religious persecutions in Republican Spain, there was also evident concern at the very active outlook of many Spanish priests in the conflict. Moreover, the bishops stated peremptorily that the Church did not want the war. It had not wanted it, but it had accepted it because it had been compelled to do so. Recourse to force in such circumstances was legitimate. The text went on to say that there had been a threat to the very existence of the common good. First, a threat to the fatherland, because the orientation of the Popular Front's policy was quite contrary to the nature and requirements of the national spirit. There had been threats to the religious spirit, too. Thus secular laws were dubbed iniquitous, attacks on Christian liberty of conscience. Afterward, there were attacks on the churches of a more material and less debatable kind. Finally, a threat to established society was conjured up indirectly, because there are constant references in the text of the danger of destructive communism and of the anti-divine revolution. It was therefore essential to fight, because it was a question of perishing under the assault of communism or attempting to overcome it. The war was depicted as a salutary reaction, as a heroic remedy against a public danger. Those who had revolted were making patriotism and the religious spirit imperatives that the Church could not repudiate. On the other hand, it was taken for granted that the whole body of social authorities and men of learning recognized the public danger, and that the conviction of learned men about the legitimacy of their triumph was absolute. Since this war was just and necessary, the Church could not remain indifferent. Because those who were fighting were supporting a sacred cause, the battle had to be made into a holy struggle. Hence the second purpose that may be assigned to the bishop's letter, to indicate in which direction the conflict should be oriented, what character it should be given. This conflict, a reaction by a religious order, was a crusade, and those taking part could be compared with the friar knights of the military orders. The cause they were defending was first of all that of Spain, but also that of all Christendom. These soldiers of God were fighting for the fundamental principles of every civilized society. It was, moreover, quite remarkable that the text began with a summons to the aid of Catholic people. This summons was unquestionably meant for the French Catholics, but also to those in South America. The reminder of a common civilization, of their adherence to Hispanidad, would make it easier to rally them to the cause. Finally, the letter refuted the idea that the war was setting the Church against the powers that be. Public authority was in ruins. To re-establish it, the leaders of the uprising had had recourse to an armed plebiscite. Once again we find here the argument invoked by its supporters ever since the beginning of the movimiento. The fact remains that the representatives of the Spanish Church categorically refused to answer for everything that was covered by the movimiento. One paragraph was particularly significant. It stated that the Church was not responsible for trends or intentions that could, in the future, disfigure the noble mean of the national movement, thus adding to the text a polemical element, clearly aimed at the phalange. It cannot be emphasized too strongly that this letter was designed for export. The stand taken by the bishops meant nothing to those who were caught up in the Spanish conflict. By contrast, its official air and its categorical tone made it a key text in the eyes of foreigners. The real face of the Spanish Civil War was being presented to the foreign chancelleries. Hence the text's insistence on stressing the collective savagery of the revolution and the anti-religious persecutions, and hence the deliberate distortion that consisted in presenting the revolution as a communist uprising, without worrying about confusing the terms. The idea was to remind everyone that what was happening in Spain went beyond the context of an ordinary civil war, because God has permitted our country to be a testing ground for the ideas and systems that aspire to conquer the world. Henceforth, the Church had taken its stand in the struggle. Its activities helped to give the regime its permanent orientation. Even more than the Jesuits, whose return at this period was significant, the Dominicans seemed to have wielded considerable influence over the nationalist leaders. Storer noted, among Franco's personal advisors, Father Menendez Riagata, the Church's influence was not merely being wielded over the general, but also over his intimates, especially his brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suner. Ever since the latter had escaped from Republican Spain in February 1937, his influence had continued to grow. Faces changed. When the first real government was formed, Suner joined it, while Nicolas Franco was sent as ambassador to Portugal.